She slammed her hand down on the auction table so hard the dishes rattled. "Good Lord, Mabel, did you bake that or dig it out of a ditch?" The laughter hit like a slap. Every head in the room turned. Clara Hutchins stood at the center of the crowd, her silk ribbon perfectly tied, her lemon cake gleaming under the lantern light, and her cruelty aimed like a rifle at the one woman in Copper Hollow who had never once asked for anyone's attention. Mabel Rourke didn't move. She stood behind a plain black Dutch oven with both hands flat on the table, her jaw tight, her eyes dry because she had learned a long time ago that tears only gave people like Clara more ammunition. And then the doors opened. If you've ever been laughed at for something you were proud of, if you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt invisible and too visible at the same time, then this story is for you. Stay until the end. Because the moment that mountain man walked through those doors changed everything. And if this story touches something in you, hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't already. We tell stories here that don't let go. Now let's go back to Copper Hollow. Mabel Rourke had been 30 years old for exactly 6 weeks when the Harvest Supper auction forced her to understand, in front of every person she had ever known, exactly what Copper Hollow thought of her. She had known it for years, of course. You don't live in a small frontier town for 3 decades without absorbing every sideways glance, every too long pause before someone answered you, every conversation that dried up when you walked into the general store. Mabel had filed all of it away in the part of herself she didn't examine too closely. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was too busy to care. Running a boarding house kitchen from 4 in the morning until 8 at night didn't leave much room for self-pity. And Mabel Rourke had never been the kind of woman who sat down to feel sorry for herself when there were 60 pounds of potatoes that needed peeling before sunrise. But the Harvest Supper was different. The Harvest Supper was the one night every year when Copper Hollow dressed itself up and pretended to be something warmer than it actually was. And the centerpiece of the whole evening was the auction table, where the unmarried women of the town displayed their best baking, and the unmarried men bid on the pleasure of sharing it with them. Nobody had ever asked Mabel Rourke why she kept participating year after year. If they had asked, she wasn't sure she could have explained it honestly. There was some stubborn part of her, a part she would have been embarrassed to name out loud, that kept showing up because she believed, stupidly and against all evidence, that this might be the year something was different. It never was. But she kept baking. She kept walking through those doors. And she kept setting her Dutch oven on that table like she had as much right to be there as Clara Hutchins, with her lemon cake and her silk ribbon and her laugh that carried across a room like a blade through dry grass. This year, Mabel had brought sourdough. Not the pale, pillowy kind that other women made. The kind that collapsed if you looked at it wrong and tasted like flour mixed with hope and not much else. Mabel's sourdough came from a starter. She had been feeding for 11 years, a living culture she had protected through 3 bad winters and one summer when the boarding house nearly went under and she'd been eating twice-boiled beans for 2 weeks straight because she couldn't afford to feed herself and the starter both, and she had chosen the starter. She had carried that culture in a covered crock through every hardship she'd known, feeding it flour and water and patience the way other women in Copper Hollow fed their children. And what it produced was dense and dark and complex in a way that grocery store bread never was and never would be. It was also ugly. She knew that. She had always known that. The crust was thick and cracked and the color of old leather, and it sat in the Dutch oven like something that had survived a fight, which it had, in a way. Every loaf she baked had survived the same starter that had survived everything Mabel had survived, and she supposed that showed. She set it on the table between Dorothy Crane's apple crumble and Ruth Finch's beautifully decorated pie, and she stood back and she looked at it and she felt, briefly, a wave of something that might have been pride before the room's attention found her. Clara Hutchins reached it first. Clara was 24 and had the kind of face that people in Copper Hollow called handsome, which meant her features were symmetrical and her figure was narrow, and her family had money enough that she had never once needed to haul anything heavier than a hat box. She had also never liked Mabel Rourke, and Mabel had never fully understood why until she got older and realized that some women felt most comfortable in a room where every other woman had been made to feel smaller than they were. Clara leaned over the Dutch oven and wrinkled her nose. "Good Lord, Mabel, did you bake that or dig it out of a ditch?" It wasn't even an original insult. Mabel had heard versions of it before. had heard variations of it her whole life, in fact, applied to her cooking, her appearance, her manner, her choice of clothing, her size, her voice, the way she walked, the way she laughed. She had developed a thick skin. Her sourdough had developed its crust, slowly, under pressure, over years. But it was the laughter that went with it that she hadn't fully prepared for. It moved through the room in a wave. Not everyone joined in. There were a few women near the back who looked at the floor and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. But enough people laughed that the sound filled the hall, and it bounced off the low ceiling and came back to Mabel from every direction at once. She kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her face still. She had learned that much, at least, how not to give Clara Hutchins the satisfaction of watching her flinch. "Looks like a river rock," said someone near Clara. Mabel didn't turn to see who. "Smells different, though," said another voice, and Mabel heard in it the particular tone of someone who was trying to be kind while not quite having the courage to say so clearly. "Different isn't a compliment, Alice," Clara said, and the laughter came again, smaller this time, but no less mean. One of Clara's particular friends, a woman named Vera Pickworth, whose husband owned the only dry goods store in town, stepped up beside her and looked at the loaf the way you'd look at an animal you weren't sure was dead. "It's awfully dark," Vera said. "You didn't burn it?" "I didn't burn it," Mabel said. Her voice came out flat and controlled, and she was proud of that, at least. "Heavy thing," Vera said, and made a small theatrical effort to lift the lid of the Dutch oven before setting it back down. "Like carrying a cannonball." Mabel said nothing. "Well," Clara straightened and smoothed her already smooth skirt and gave Mabel a look of practiced sympathy that was crueler than the mockery had been. "It's the effort that counts, I suppose. Not everyone has a gift for it." And then she turned away, and the crowd drifted with her, back to the decorated cakes and the ribbon-wrapped baskets, and the things that looked like what they were supposed to look like. And Mabel stood alone behind her ugly black pot and breathed through her nose and thought about the 11 years she had spent keeping that starter alive. The auction began at 7:30. Mabel watched. She had watched it happen before, but it had never been quite this clear-cut, this definitive, this impossible to explain away. The room shifted without quite knowing why, the way it does when something genuinely unexpected has entered it, and Mabel looked up from her Dutch oven and saw Silas Crowder for the first time in 3 years. She knew who he was in the way that everyone in Copper Hollow knew who he was. By reputation, more than acquaintance. Silas Crowder was the mountain. He trapped and hunted above the town in terrain that most men in Copper Hollow wouldn't enter in summer, let alone winter. He came down maybe twice a year to trade his pelts and resupply, and he never stayed longer than he had to, and he looked exactly like a man who lived that way, broad and weathered and quietly enormous, with the kind of stillness about him that came from spending most of his life in places where unnecessary movement attracted attention from things with claws. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room. Mabel watched him the way she always watched things she couldn't quite categorize, carefully, without committing to any expression. He ignored the lemon cake. He ignored Dorothy Crane's apple crumble. He walked past the table where the pretty things had been, and he moved with the particular unhurried certainty of a man who already knew where he was going, and where he was going, Mabel realized with a jolt that went through her sternum like cold water, was directly toward her. He stopped in front of the Dutch oven. He looked at it for a moment without saying anything. Then, without asking permission and without explanation, he lifted the lid and tore off a piece of the loaf with his hand, and he ate it there in front of the whole room in a way that was so completely unself-conscious that Mabel forgot for a moment to be affronted by it. He chewed slowly. He looked at the middle distance somewhere above Mabel's head. He seemed to be thinking. The room had gone very quiet. Then Silas Crowder reached into his coat and put a $20 gold coin on the table. The sound of it landing was small, but the silence around it made it enormous. "That one," he said. His voice was low and unhurried and accustomed to speaking outdoors in wind. "That's food built for winter." Mabel stared at the coin. Clara Hutchins made a sound. Mabel didn't look at her. Garfield the auctioneer said something about the bidding being open, but it came out slightly strangled and nobody offered a counter, partly because nobody in Copper Hollow had $20 to throw at a loaf of bread, and partly because something in Silas Crowder's manner made it very clear that this particular matter was settled. He was looking at Mabel now, not at her Dutch oven, at her. "You made this," he said. that it wasn't a question. I did, Mabel said. How long's that starter been running? She blinked. Of every question she had ever been asked about her bread, nobody in Copper Hollow had ever thought to ask about the starter. 11 years, she said. Something in his expression shifted. She couldn't have named what it was exactly. Approval wasn't quite the right word, and respect felt like too large a word to reach for. But whatever it was, she felt it land. 11 years, he repeated. Through 3 bad winters, she said, and she didn't know why she added that except that it seemed suddenly important that he understood what she was actually talking about. 3, he said. And 1 summer that nearly broke me, she said, and then she stopped because she hadn't meant to say that last part out loud. He didn't look away. He didn't look embarrassed on her behalf. He just nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when someone has told you something that confirms what you already suspected. I'll close that lid, he said, if that's all right. It's your bread now, Mabel said. You paid enough for it. The corner of his mouth moved. It might have been a smile. With his face, it was hard to be sure. He replaced the lid of the Dutch oven carefully, more carefully than Clara Hutchins had put it back, she noticed. And he looked at Mabel again with that same direct, unreadable attention. I'd like to share it, he said. That's the point of the thing, isn't it? Mabel looked at the $20 gold coin still sitting on the table. She looked at Silas Crowder. She looked at the rest of the room, where 30 people were watching them with an assortment of expressions ranging from confused to annoyed to something she thought might be chastened. It is, she said. She picked up the coin. She picked up the Dutch oven. She followed Silas Crowder out of the harvest hall into the cold Montana night, and she did not look back to see what Clara Hutchins' face was doing. She already knew what it looked like. She had been looking at that face her whole life. Outside, the dark was complete, and the cold was immediate, and the stars over Copper Hollow were the kind that only showed up this far from city lights. Dense and indifferent and very old. Silas led her to the livery stable at the edge of the main street, where a large, dark draft horse stood patient and steam-breathed in the stall, and he hung a lantern from a post and produced from his pack a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to contain smoked venison and a wedge of hard cheese, and he set them out on the edge of a clean stall board without ceremony, the way men who eat alone most of the time set out food, practically, without pretension. He cut 2 portions of the bread with a folding knife he drew from his belt. He handed one to Mabel without asking if she was hungry. She was hungry. She was always hungry after a long evening of standing in a room that didn't want her, which burned through energy in ways she couldn't entirely explain. They ate in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised her. You came down from the mountain for the harvest supper? She asked, because the alternative was silence, and she had said what she had to say about the bread, and she was curious. Came down for supplies, he said. Saw the lights. You don't usually stay for things like this. I don't, he agreed. He wasn't apologetic about it. He wasn't explaining himself. He was simply confirming a fact. What made you stay tonight? She asked. He looked at the Dutch oven sitting between them on the stall board. Smelled something worth stopping for, he said. Mabel looked at him for a moment. The bread. The bread, he confirmed, and then he looked at her with that same directness and said, and I wanted to see who made it. She looked away first. She wasn't sure why. It's not a pretty loaf, she said. She didn't know why she said it. Some habit of preemptive defense, probably. Pretty doesn't last 3 bad winters, he said. She looked back at him. He was eating his venison. He didn't seem to realize he'd said anything remarkable. But Mabel Rourke sat in the lantern light of the Copper Hollow livery stable with hard cheese and dark sourdough and the cold mountain air coming in under the door. And she felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Like someone had noticed the right thing. Not the thing she was supposed to be, the thing she actually was. Silas set down the last piece of bread and looked at her in that quiet, measuring way he had. The way she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at everything, assessing weight and reliability. The way you assess a rope you're about to trust with your life. I'm going to say something direct, he said. All right, said Mabel. I live alone on that mountain, have for 7 years. I can sustain myself. I'm not struggling. He paused. But there are things one person cannot do as well as 2. There are winters that are survivable alone and winters that aren't, and last year was the second kind, and I got through it, but... He stopped. But, she said. But I don't want another one of those, he said plainly. And I've been thinking about what kind of person could actually live that life. And it's not. He looked at the hall behind them, its warm windows spilling yellow light into the dark. It's not whoever they're celebrating in there. Mabel was very still. I'm 35 years old, he said. I've got a cabin and 160 acres and a woodlot and a root cellar, and I know what I'm doing up there. What I need is a partner, somebody who isn't afraid of work or cold or silence. The lantern flame moved between them. Are you asking me to marry you, Mabel said, or are you interviewing me for a position? He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved again. Yes, he said. She almost laughed. She didn't, but she almost did. You've been in there for 20 minutes, she said. You've eaten one piece of my bread. I know how to read bread, he said. Takes the same patience to make a starter last 11 years as it takes to get through a winter above 9,000 feet. You don't panic. You don't cut corners. You feed it when it needs feeding, even when you've got nothing to spare for yourself. He looked at her steadily. That's the person I need. Mabel stared at him. She thought about what was waiting for her in Copper Hollow. More mornings at 4 a.m., more sacks of flour, more Clara Hutchins, more of the particular exhaustion that came from being productive and capable and completely invisible, from being the woman people called when something needed doing and overlooked when something was being celebrated. She thought about 3 bad winters. She thought about the starter she had kept alive by choosing it over herself. She thought about what Silas Crowder had said. Pretty doesn't last 3 bad winters. I won't be your servant, she said. I won't take orders like I'm hired help. I'm not asking for that. And if I do this, I do it as an equal. Work divided by ability, decisions made together. That's what I said. You said partner, she said. I want to be sure you know what that means. He met her eyes. I know what it means, he said. Do you? The lantern swayed slightly in a draft from the stable door. Mabel Rourke looked at Silas Crowder across a black Dutch oven in the lantern light of the Copper Hollow livery stable, and she made the most consequential decision of her life in the same way she made every other decision. Not because it was safe, and not because it was certain, but because every piece of evidence she had told her it was true. Yes, she said. I'll do it. He nodded once. We'll need to be on the trail before first light, storms coming by midweek. I'll need to pack, she said. I figured, he said. I've got the wagon. They finished the bread in silence. Neither of them said anything about love. Neither of them said anything about the future. They ate the food and let the decision settle between them like something solid, like something built to last. And Mabel Rourke looked out at the mountain dark beyond the livery door and understood, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was not already at the end of her story. She was standing at the beginning of a harder one, and she was not afraid. They were married at 4 a.m. by a justice of the peace named Harold Birch, who lived above the post office and answered his door in a nightshirt and did not ask a single question beyond the legal ones, which Mabel appreciated more than she could say. There were no flowers. There were no witnesses beyond Harold's sleepy wife, who stood in the doorway holding a candle and blinking. Mabel wore the same clothes she had worn to the harvest supper because she hadn't had time to change, and she wasn't going to pretend that mattered. Silas stood beside her with his hat in his hands and said the words when he was supposed to say them, clearly and without hesitation, and Mabel said hers the same way, and Harold Birch signed the paper and handed it to Silas and went back to bed, and that was the whole of it. Mabel had imagined her wedding day exactly once in her life, when she was about 16 and still believed in the version of things that other people described. In that imagining, there had been a church and a dress and people she loved sitting in rows, and the man at the end of the aisle had no face because she couldn't invent one that felt real. She had given up on that imagining a long time ago, filed it in the same place she filed other things that weren't going to happen, and she had not missed it until this exact moment, standing outside Harold Birch's door in the pre-dawn dark with a marriage certificate and a man she had known for 6 hours. She didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't the kind of thing you said to a man like Silas Crowder at 4 a.m. when there was a mountain to climb before a storm arrived. They loaded the wagon in the dark. Mabel's possessions were not extensive. She had spent her adult life in a boarding house room that was 14 feet by 12 feet and had learned accordingly to own things that justified their space. Her cast iron cookware, which was substantial, her spinning wheel, disassembled and wrapped in canvas, her winter clothes, her seed box, which held 3 varieties of vegetable seed she had been saving and selecting for 5 years, her tool roll, her 2 books, the covered crock containing the starter, packed carefully in the center of a flour sack for insulation and cushioning, because if she was going to start a life on a mountain, she was going to bring the 11 years of that starter with her, or she was going to have a serious conversation with herself about her priorities. Silas didn't comment on the crock. He didn't comment on any of it. He loaded what she handed him with the methodical efficiency of a man who had been packing wagons in the dark his whole adult life, distributing weight without being asked, securing loads with rope and patterns that Mabel recognized as functional rather than habitual. He knew what he was doing. She filed that away. They left Copper Hollow at 4:30 in the morning without saying goodbye to anyone, which suited Mabel fine. She had said what she needed to say to Copper Hollow the night before by walking out of that harvest hall and not looking back, and she didn't have anything to add. The first hour was easy going, flat road along the valley floor, the horse moving at a steady walk, the dark on both sides of them thick and cold and full of the sounds of things that lived in it without needing light. Mabel sat on the wagon bench with her coat buttoned to her throat and watched the sky ahead of them go from black to the particular deep blue that came just before the first gray of dawn, and she thought about the fact that she was married and leaving the only town she had ever lived in and heading into a wilderness she had seen only from a distance, and she waited to feel afraid. She didn't, particularly. She felt cold. She felt the particular hollow tiredness of a night without sleep. She felt the wagon bench hard under her and the horse's breath steaming back toward them in the dark. She felt the weight of the Dutch oven in the bed of the wagon behind her, and she felt, underneath everything else, a low, persistent hum of something she eventually identified as anticipation. Not hope exactly, more like the feeling of finally moving in a direction after years of standing still. Silas drove without speaking. She didn't find it uncomfortable. She was not a woman who needed conversation to fill space, which was one of the reasons she had always been better with bread than with people. Bread didn't require you to perform warmth you didn't feel. You just had to do the work. After an hour and a half, when the dawn had arrived in full and the flat valley road had given way to the first climbing switchbacks of the mountain trail, he said, "You warm enough?" "I'm fine," she said. He reached behind the bench without looking and produced a wool blanket that had seen considerable use and handed it to her. She took it without arguing. It smelled like wood smoke and something animal and clean cold air, and she put it over her legs and was grateful for it. "How far?" she asked. "Good conditions? 4 hours," he said. "It's not going to be good conditions." She looked at the sky. The light was thin and the color of it wasn't right. Too yellow at the edges, too flat in the middle. She had spent enough years reading weather out of boarding house windows to know what that sky was building toward. "Rain," she said. "Freezing rain, up top," he said. "It'll hold until mid-morning, probably." "Probably," she repeated. "I don't make promises about weather," he said. "Neither do I," she said. They drove. The switchbacks grew steeper and the trees changed character, from the scrubby cottonwood and ash of the valley floor to the dense pine of the lower slopes, taller and darker and closer to the road, their branches holding the cold the way they held snow. The horse, a big gray animal named Cobb that Silas had introduced by name and nothing else, worked the grade steadily without needing to be pushed, which told Mabel something about how often he'd made this climb. "He knows this road," she said. "Born knowing it, near enough," Silas said. "He's made it 100 times. How old is he?" 14. "Good age for a horse." "Good age for a horse who's been treated right," Silas said, and there was something in the way he said it, flat and factual, that made Mabel think it was not only a statement about the horse. The rain started at 8:30. It began as ordinary rain, cold, sharp, the kind that found the gaps in your collar and worked its way down your back no matter how well you were buttoned. And Silas handed her an oilcloth without comment that she spread across her lap and tucked around her sides. And for a while it was simply unpleasant in the way that mountain weather was unpleasant, and nothing more than that. Then the temperature dropped. She felt it happen. Not gradually. There was a moment, a distinct and specific moment, when the air changed quality, when the rain hitting her hands shifted from cold to something sharper, something that stung in a different way, and she looked at the road ahead of them and saw the surface beginning to change. "Silas," she said. "I see it," he said. The freezing rain was coating everything. The road surface, already steep and soft from the autumn, was going glassy in patches, and Cobb was beginning to adjust his footing in the particular careful way horses had when the ground stopped behaving the way ground was supposed to behave. Silas tightened his grip on the reins but kept his hands steady, kept his voice low and even when he spoke to the horse, kept the wagon moving at a pace that Mabel could see him calculating in real time. Slow enough for safety, fast enough to maintain momentum on the grade, because if they stopped on this incline, they were not going to start again easily. They were 3/4 of the way up the worst of the switchbacks when the rear wheels lost purchase. It happened slowly at first, a sensation of the wagon sitting down rather than forward, of the weight redistributing itself in a way that was wrong, and Cobb lurched and tried to compensate and couldn't, and the wagon began to slide. Not fast, not catastrophically, not yet. But the road fell away steeply on the downhill side, and the drop below them was significant, and the ice was getting worse every minute, and Silas was hauling back on the reins with both arms braced and his whole body weight behind it. And Cobb was working. The horse was trying hard, but the wagon was heavier than the horse could hold on ice on a 20-degree grade, and the math of it was not working. Mabel did not think about it. There wasn't time to think about it, and she had found over the years that the things that required thinking about were rarely the things that required doing. Those things simply required you to do them. She dropped off the wagon bench. She went around the back of it while the wagon was still moving, carefully, one hand on the sideboard, feet finding purchase on the ice one step at a time. And she put herself behind the rear axle, and she pushed. Her boots found the road the way her hands found things in the dark kitchen at 4 in the morning, by pressure and instinct and years of knowing how her own body worked. She was not a small woman. She had shoulders built by a decade and a half of hauling and lifting and doing physical work that the men she fed underestimated because it happened in a kitchen rather than a field. She set her weight low the way you had to on ice, and she drove with her legs, not her back, and she pushed. The wagon stopped sliding. It didn't go forward, not yet. It just stopped going backward, which was enough. "Hold," Silas said, and she couldn't tell if he was talking to her or the horse, but she held. He did something with the reins that she didn't see. She felt the wagon shudder and shift. She pushed again, a hard, deliberate thrust that came from her heels, through her calves, through her thighs, and didn't stop until it reached her hands flat against the cold iron of the axle housing. And the wagon moved forward, half a foot, then a foot. Then Cobb found something that wasn't ice and leaned into his harness, and the wagon lurched up and forward, and Mabel went with it 2 more steps before she let go, and stood in the road breathing hard with her hands on her knees. The wagon stopped on flat ground 10 yards ahead. Silas set the brake and sat still for a moment. Mabel straightened up. Her thighs were shaking. She hadn't noticed that while she was doing it. She noticed it now. She put her hands on her hips and breathed through her nose and waited for her legs to stop complaining. After a moment, Silas climbed down from the bench and walked back to where she was standing. He looked at the road behind them. He looked at the ruts in the ice where the wagon had been. He looked at the tracks her boots had made, deep, clean impressions pressed into the softening surface where the ice had cracked under the force of her weight. He stood there for a while looking at those tracks. "Good," he said. That was the whole of it. One word. He said it the way you'd say it about a joint cut right or a knot tied correctly, with the particular economy of someone who didn't use language as decoration. She understood immediately that it was not a small thing from him. From Silas Crowder, good was not a filler word. It was a verdict. Her legs were still shaking. She didn't show him that. "We should keep moving," she said, "before it gets worse." "Yes," he said, and walked back to the wagon, and Mabel followed him, and they climbed back onto the bench, and Cobb started up the last of the grade without being asked. The rain eased off by the time they crested the ridge. Above the tree line, the world opened up in a way that Mabel was not prepared for. She had looked at this mountain her whole life from the valley below, and she had constructed from that distance a picture of what it was, and the picture was wrong in every particular. It was both larger and more specific than she had imagined. Larger in the sense that you could feel the scale of it in your chest, in the way the sky sat differently up here, higher and older looking, the clouds closer to you than they had any right to be. More specific in the sense that it was not a grand and abstract wilderness, but a collection of very particular things. This exact boulder, this stand of white bark pine with that specific split in the largest trunk, this meadow that was brown now but must be extraordinary in summer, this view of the valley below, that was so far down it looked like a thing you'd put in a letter to describe what distance meant. Silas watched her take it in. "Well," she said after a while. "Yeah," he said. She didn't have anything more articulate than that, and apparently neither did he, and that was fine. The cabin was another hour past the ridge, a solid, low-roofed structure of notched logs set into a protected hollow below a granite outcrop that broke the worst of the north wind. It was not large. It was not pretty in any way she could identify, but it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing, someone who understood that a structure's job up here was to survive rather than to impress. And every element of it, the deep-set windows, the wide overhanging roof, the stone foundation raised above the frost line, showed that understanding. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in front of it. She was exhausted in the full-body way that came from a sleepless night and sustained physical effort in the particular emotional expenditure of making enormous decisions in very short windows of time. Her boots were soaked through and her shoulders ached from the push on the road, and she smelled like wet wool and wood smoke, and she was standing in front of a cabin she had never been inside in a marriage that was 6 hours old. She thought about the harvest hall. She thought about Clara Hutchins' face when she had set her ugly Dutch oven on that table. Then she picked up the crock with the starter in it and carried it to the cabin door. "Lock?" she asked. "Bar," he said, and showed her the timber bar on the inside that secured the door from within, and she filed that away too. The inside of the cabin was as functional as the outside. A single main room with a stone hearth at one end, a work surface along one wall, rope-strung bunks at the other end, a rough table and 2 chairs in the center. Practical, cold. Not filthy, but not recently tended either. The dust of a man who lived alone and didn't notice dust because dust didn't affect his ability to get through a winter. Mabel set the starter crock on the work surface. She looked at the hearth. She looked at the stack of split wood beside it. She looked at the flint and steel on the mantel. She looked at the pot hanging on the iron arm over where the fire would be. Then she built the fire. She didn't ask if he wanted her to. It was cold, and she was cold, and there was wood, and she knew how to use it. She built it small and fast and fed it up methodically until the stone hearth was drawing properly and the heat was beginning to move through the room. Silas came in from scene to cob and stopped just inside the door. He looked at the fire. He looked at Mabel, standing with the poker, pushing the coals into arrangement. "Coffee's in the tin on the shelf," he said, "if you want it." "I want it," she said. He took his coat off and hung it and got the coffee tin in the pot, and Mabel watched him move in his own kitchen, efficiently, without wasted motion, everything exactly where it had been when he last needed it. He knew this space the way she knew the boarding house kitchen. That was something, she thought. A person who didn't know their own kitchen was a person who didn't cook seriously, and a person who didn't cook seriously at this altitude was a person who didn't last long. They drank the coffee at the table. It was black and strong, and she wrapped both hands around the cup and let it warm her fingers, and she looked around the cabin in the morning light coming through the deep-set windows and took stock the way she always took stock, methodically, without sentiment, assessing what was there and what wasn't, and what could be improved and what was probably fine as it was. "You don't have much in the way of preserves," she said. "I've got smoked meat and dried fish," he said. "Root cellar's got potatoes and some turnip. Do you have any fat put by? Lard or tallow? Some tallow. Vinegar? A jug. Salt? Plenty." She nodded. "Your knife situation is good," she said. She had noticed the tools racked neatly above the work surface. 3 knives of different sizes, all of them well-maintained, edges that caught the light correctly. He looked at her like she had said something unexpected. "You looked at my knives?" "I look at everything," she said. "It's how I know what I'm working with." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What else did you notice?" She considered. "You've got a crack in the mortar at the north corner of the hearth that'll need repointing before hard winter. Your water situation isn't clear to me yet. I assume there's a source. Your wood's good, the split is right, but the stack's not going to last past February the way it is. And you're going to need to show me where things are. The storage. The root cellar. The tools. I can't be useful if I'm spending half my energy finding things. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. And I want to know what we're dealing with in terms of neighbors, she said. Who's on this mountain? Who can be counted on, and who can't? That's a short list, he said. There's a family named Alderman, 6 miles northeast, on the other side of the granite shelf. Husband, wife, 2 small kids. Solid people. There's a trapper named Gus Fenwick who runs the Eastern Ridge. He's reliable in an emergency and unreliable about everything else. And there's a man named Devereaux about 4 miles south who I stay away from. Why? Because the last 3 winters he's made decisions about his supplies that affected whether his neighbors could afford to make it to spring, and not in a way that was accidental, Silas said. His voice was flat and even and completely serious. Mabel looked at him over her coffee cup. He takes advantage. He sells in emergencies, Silas said, at prices that are criminal by any standard except the one that says a man can charge what the market will bear when the market is a family with children and no other options. And nobody's done anything about it. Nobody's organized enough up here to do anything about it, he said, and in good winters, it doesn't matter enough to be worth the conflict. Mabel filed that away too. What kind of winter is this one shaping up to be? He looked out the window. Bad, he said. Maybe the worst I've seen in 12 years. She nodded slowly. Then we'd better be ready. That's why I have a partner, he said. She looked at him across the table. He was not a man she could read easily. His face didn't work the way most people's faces worked, didn't display its owner's internal weather in ways she was accustomed to reading. But he had said what he said at the harvest hall, and he had said what he said about the bread, and he had said good on that icy road, and she had understood every single time exactly what he meant. She thought that might be enough to work with. Show me the root cellar, she said. He showed her the root cellar. It was dug into the hillside behind the cabin, solidly constructed and cold stored in the way that only a hillside cellar in this climate could be cold stored, deeply and evenly, maintaining a temperature that would keep root vegetables and preserved goods through a long winter without freezing them solid. He had, as he said, potatoes and turnips, some dried beans, a barrel of smoked fish, 2 haunches of venison wrapped in cloth and hanging from a ceiling hook, a crock of pickled something she would investigate later, salt, flour, a good amount of flour, she noted with satisfaction, cornmeal, dried apples. It was not nothing. With careful management, it was the beginning of something she could work with. You need more fat, she said, and more acid, vinegar or brine or something fermented. Your body needs it in winter or you get slow and your thinking goes wrong. I know about scurvy, he said. I didn't say scurvy, she said. I said your thinking goes wrong. It happens slower and earlier than the physical symptoms, and most people don't notice it because they're the ones whose thinking is going wrong. He was quiet. What do you do about it? Fermented things, she said. Properly lacto-fermented vegetables hold their nutrition through winter in ways that dried things don't. And dried sprouts? You can sprout dried beans and seeds even in winter, even inside, and they'll give you what you need. He looked at her with that assessing look. You know that from the boarding house? I know that from watching men who came through the boarding house in March, looking like dead things walking, and men who came through looking human, she said. The difference was almost always what they'd been eating all winter. He was quiet for a while, looking at the root cellar. Then, what do you need? Time and a good pot, she said. I brought my own pots. The first week was the steepest learning curve of Mabel's adult life, and she had had some steep ones. She was not new to work. She was not new to cold or to early mornings or to physical exhaustion or to environments that required constant vigilance and effort. But running a boarding house kitchen was work she had done so long that her body knew it in its sleep. She didn't have to think about it the way she had to think about this. Here, everything was unfamiliar and everything mattered. The wrong decision about water rationing could mean a cracked pipe. The wrong decision about fire management could mean a cold night when cold nights at this altitude were dangerous and not merely uncomfortable. The geography of the place, where the wind came from, where the shadows fell, which slopes drained and which ones held ice, where the water source ran and where it froze first, was all information she had to acquire from scratch and quickly, because the mountain didn't wait for you to be ready. She asked Silas questions constantly in those first days. She asked them directly, without apology, and he answered them the same way, directly, without padding, which she appreciated in a way she couldn't have explained to someone who hadn't spent years dealing with people who softened everything so much the actual information got lost. She asked him about the water. He showed her the spring 30 yards up the slope and the wooden channel that brought it to a collecting barrel beside the cabin, and where the barrel sometimes froze at the overflow fitting and what to do about it. She asked him about the firewood, how much they needed to take them to March, what that number looked like in terms of cords, how much time it took to cut and split and stack it. He told her the number and she did the calculation and told him they were short by a third, and he looked at the woodpile for a long time in silence and then said she was right. They spent 3 days cutting and splitting. Working opposite ends of the two-man crosscut saw that Silas had kept for a partner he hadn't yet had, and Mabel's hands blistered in the first day, and she bandaged them at night and went back to the saw in the morning. He didn't tell her she didn't have to. She didn't tell him her hands hurt. They were past that, she thought, from the moment she'd held that wagon on the ice. In the evenings, after the work of the day was done, they sat at the table while the fire burned down and Mabel cooked whatever was practical and Silas cleaned his trapping equipment or worked leather, and they talked. Not always about practical things. Sometimes about practical things. What she'd noticed in the root cellar, what he'd seen on the ridge that day, what needed doing the next morning. But sometimes about other things. She told him about the boarding house, not the work of it, but the texture of it. The particular loneliness of being essential to a place while being incidental to its inhabitants, of cooking 3 meals a day for 20 men and having almost none of them know her name. He listened without interjecting, which was rarer than people thought. "Did you want them to know your name?" he asked when she'd stopped. She thought about it honestly. "I wanted them to know the name of whoever was feeding them," she said. "I didn't care particularly if it was mine specifically, but it was yours specifically." "It was," she said, 11 years of it. 11 years is a long time to do something you got nothing back from. She looked at him. "I got wages," she said, "and the knowledge that I was good at it. Is that enough?" She thought about that for longer. "It was enough to survive on," she said finally. "It wasn't enough to want to stay." He looked at the fire. "No," he said. "I know how that is." "You do?" "I came up here because there was nothing in the valley I wanted to stay for either," he said. "Different reasons." Same answer. She looked at him, the side of his face, the firelight on it. "What were your reasons?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I had a wife before." She went still. "She died," he said. 7 years ago. 3 months after we married, which wasn't long enough for me to know her the way I wanted to, but was long enough for it to matter." He paused. "Fever. It came fast." Mabel looked at her hands. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know you are," he said, which was a strange thing to say, and also true somehow. "After that, I didn't want to be anywhere that had her in it. So I came up here where she'd never been, and it was hard enough that I didn't have time to think about much else, and then 7 years went by and I was still here." He looked at her. "I'm not telling you so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you know you're not the first thing I've tried to build here." Mabel looked back at him. "And the starter," she said. He lifted an eyebrow slightly, the closest thing she'd seen to surprise on his face. "What you said at the auction," she said. "About 11 years and 3 bad winters. You weren't just talking about bread." He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. "I wasn't." She nodded slowly. She understood that. She understood it in the specific way you understood something when it matched a shape that was already in you, not because someone explained it, but because you already knew it from the inside. "I'm not her," she said. Not unkindly. "No," he said. "You're not." "And I'm not going to try to be," she said. "I didn't come up here to fill someone else's shape." "I know that," he said. "That's part of why I asked." They sat with the fire for a while after that without talking. The wind came up outside, that particular high-altitude wind that had weight behind it. Not just cold air moving, but something more intentional, something that rattled the shutters and pushed against the cabin walls as if it was testing the structure. Mabel listened to it. She listened to the way the cabin answered it, the logs settling, the hearth drawing harder, the shutters holding. The cabin held. It was built to hold. She thought about that. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the kitchen the way she needed it organized. Not to erase what had been there before, but to arrange it for two people who cooked differently and needed to work in the same space without collision. She brought the starter back to life properly, feeding it with the mountain water that tasted unlike any water she had used before, cleaner and colder and slightly mineral in a way that changed the bread's character subtly, in a way she would have to learn. The first mountain loaf she baked came out denser than she intended. She ate it anyway without comment. It was still good, dense and close-crumbed but complex and deeply flavored in the way that only a long-fermented loaf could be. And when Silas ate his first slice, he didn't say anything except, "It's different from the valley." "Different how?" she asked. He thought about it. "Colder," he said. "The flavor, I mean, sharper." "It's the water," she said. "I'll have to adjust." "Don't," he said, and cut another slice. She adjusted anyway, incrementally, over the next 3 weeks, not to erase the sharpness, but to refine it, to find the proportion of feeding time to proving time that made the best of what the mountain water brought to the culture. Bread was a conversation with your environment. She had always known that. She had just never had this particular environment to have the conversation with before. The second loaf was better, the fourth was good, the sixth was what it was supposed to be. Mountain bread, built from mountain water, with 11 years of history in its culture and something new in its flavor that she didn't have a word for yet. Silas ate the sixth loaf over 3 days in the way he ate her bread. Systematically, without comment, the way you ate something you intended to keep eating, not the way you ate something you were deciding about. "Good," he said, on the last slice. She put more flour in the crock. She was learning him the way she learned kitchens, by observation, by paying attention to the things he didn't say as much as the things he did, by noticing what he reached for, and what he avoided and what happened to his face in the moment before he controlled it. I was not easy to read, but he was readable if you were patient, and patience was something Mabel had in considerable supply. She learned that he slept badly in the 3rd week of every month, and that he was aware of this and managed it by rising early and working until the tiredness won. She learned that he ate when he was working and forgot to eat when he wasn't, which was a dangerous habit at altitude, and one she addressed by simply keeping food on the table at regular intervals and not making it a discussion. She learned that he was meticulous about his tools and cavalier about his clothing, which explained the state of his shirts, which she began mending without asking his opinion about it. He noticed. He didn't say anything. 2 days later, she found a section of her spinning wheel that had been cracked. She'd been meaning to address it. Repaired cleanly with a splice and a steel pin that was practically invisible unless you knew where to look. He'd done it without telling her. She didn't say anything either. That was how things worked between them. She was beginning to understand it. He respected what she did by paying attention to it. She respected what he did the same way. There was no ceremony around it, and no language for it except the language of things done and noticed and done back again. A kind of conversation that had been going on since before people had words, and that worked well in a place where words were limited by the cold and by two people who had both been alone long enough to have learned that you didn't have to fill every silence. But there were silences she was less comfortable with. The question of the sleeping arrangement was one she had made a decision about on the first night. They were two people who needed sleep, and the cabin was cold and warmth was a practical matter rather than a sentimental one. And she said so plainly, and he had looked at her with something she thought might be relief and said, "Right then." And that was the end of it. They slept in the same bunk with the practicality of people who were cold and tired and needed rest. And it was not romantic, and it was not uncomfortable, and it was exactly what it was. Warmth and rest shared between two people who had other things on their minds. But sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and lie still in the dark and listen to the wind on the cabin and feel the warmth of another body for the first time in years. And she would feel something that she couldn't entirely categorize. Not longing exactly, not dissatisfaction, more like awareness of how long she had been without this. Not the particular warmth of any specific person, but the warmth of another human life at close quarters, and how much she had told herself she didn't miss it, and how the telling had been, if not exactly a lie, then not exactly the truth either. She didn't say any of that. She got up and stoked the fire. One morning in the 4th week, she came in from checking the water barrel to find him sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing something. He folded it when she came in, not quickly, not with the energy of something being hidden, but with the particular unhurriedness of someone putting something away that was theirs alone. She hung up her coat. "What are you writing?" she asked. "List," he said. "Of what?" He unfolded the paper and set it on the table between them. It was a list, but not a practical one. It wasn't food stores or woodcutting or repairs. It was a list of names. People he'd known, she realized after a moment. People from the valley and from the mountain. Some marked through. She didn't ask about the ones marked through. "I write them down every year before winter," he said. "People I'd want to know about if something happened." She looked at the list. She didn't see her own name on it. She hadn't expected to. She had been here 4 weeks. But she noticed the empty space at the bottom of the page. He took the pencil and wrote her name. Not Mabel Crowder, just Mabel. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said, and folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. Outside, the wind that had been building since morning finally made up its mind, and the first real snow of winter. Not a flurry, not a dusting, but a full and serious mountain snowstorm arrived against the windows of the cabin with a sound like an exhaled breath, like something that had been holding itself back for weeks, finally letting go. Mabel turned to the fire. She built it up properly, the way she'd learned in the past 4 weeks. The larger logs placed to last, the smaller ones placed to draw. The damper opened to the right degree for the wind direction tonight. Then she put the kettle on and began to think about what there was for supper. She heard Silas move to stand beside her. Not close enough to crowd, just close enough to be there. And they both looked at the fire for a moment. "How are we for wood?" she asked. "Good through March now," he said. She nodded. Outside, the storm arrived in full, and the cabin answered it the way it always did, by holding, quietly, with the absolute conviction of something that had been built by someone who knew what was coming. The storm that arrived the night Silas wrote her name on his list turned out to be only the beginning of what that winter intended to do. By the end of November, they had seen 4 significant snowfalls, 2 of which came back to back with only 36 hours between them. Not enough time for the first to settle before the second arrived and compacted it into something dense and deceptive that looked walkable from the cabin window and was not. Mabel learned that lesson on the 3rd day of December when she went out to check the water channel and sank to her knee in a drift that had looked solid and wasn't, and came back inside with a soaked boot and a temper she kept to herself because being angry about weather was a waste of energy, and she was not in the habit of wasting energy. She wrung out her sock by the fire. Silas watched her from across the room without comment. He had a look sometimes, not smug, not amused exactly, more like a man who had made the same mistake once and recognized the particular expression of someone doing it for the first time and knew better than to say so. "There's a probe rod by the door," he said, "behind the snowshoes." "I saw it," she said. "It's there for that reason." "I said I saw it," she said. He went back to what he was doing. She used the probe rod after that. Every time, without exception, without ever mentioning it again. December found them a rhythm that neither of them had articulated, and both of them had settled into the way you settle into a chair that happens to fit, not because it was designed for you specifically, but because it had been used enough to accommodate the shape of whoever sat in it. Silas was on the trapline before first light most mornings, gone for stretches of 4 to 6 hours depending on the weather and what the line looked like, returning by midday with pelts or game, or sometimes nothing at all, and the particular tight-jawed quiet of a man who had put in hours of cold work for no result. Mabel had the mornings to herself, which she had not expected to value as much as she did. She ran the cabin in those morning hours with the focused efficiency of someone who had been getting up before dawn her whole adult life and had learned to do 5 things simultaneously, not because she was talented at it, but because there had never been anyone else to do the other 4. Fire management, water. The starter, which required attention every morning, checking its temperature, its activity, its smell, feeding it at the right stage of its cycle, so the bread that came from it had the structure she was aiming for. The fermentation crocks she had set up along the warmest wall in the cabin, 3 of them now. One for the lacto-fermented turnip she had started in the 3rd week. One for a bean brine that she was using as the acid element in their diet that she had explained to Silas and that he had accepted without argument, and one experimental crock of dried apple vinegar that was taking longer than she liked but was moving in the right direction. She also began mapping the root cellar properly. Not just inventorying what was there, but tracking consumption rates, calculating forward to March, and then to April, which was the earliest they could reasonably expect to supplement their stores with anything from outside. The math was not frightening, but it was not comfortable either. If the winter ran long, and Silas had said it might, had said it with the flat certainty of a man who read weather patterns the way other men read books, then the margins were thinner than she wanted. She didn't say that to Silas immediately. She lived with the numbers for 3 days, turning them over in different lights, looking for the calculation she'd made wrong. She hadn't made one. The numbers were what they were. On the 4th day, she put the inventory sheet on the table when he came in. He sat down and looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was how he read things, all the way through, quietly, before he said anything. "You've factored in the fermentation crocks," he said. "I've factored in what they'll contribute once they're ready," she said, "which isn't yet." "The bean brine one's close," he said. "Brine, yes. The beans themselves need another 2 weeks minimum." He turned the paper over as if there might be something on the back, which there wasn't. "You're saying we're short." "I'm saying we're fine through February," she said. "After that, it depends on what you bring in from the trap line and whether the deer are moving where you think they are." "They should be." "Should be isn't the same as are." "No," he said, "it isn't." She sat down across from him. "I want to go through the cellar again with you, not because I don't trust my own count. I counted twice. I want to see if there's anything I'm missing. Sometimes there are things stored the way a person stores them when they're living alone that look like one thing and are actually another." He looked at her with that slightly tilted attention she was coming to know. "What do you mean?" "I mean, sometimes people who live alone store things in ways that make sense to them and nobody else," she said. "You might have something down there I looked at and classified wrong." He thought about that. "There's a box in the northeast corner behind the turnip barrel," he said. "I didn't mention it." She looked at him. "It was hers," he said. "My wife's. She'd put up preserves the summer we moved here, and I didn't open it after." The silence in the room was specific. 7 years, Mabel said. 7 years, he said. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She thought about what she wanted to say, and what she should say, and whether they were the same thing. "The preserves would be bad by now," she said finally. "I know that. But the jars are good," she said. "If there are jars in there, the jars are good. Glass doesn't go bad." He sat with that for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I can get them out," she said, "if you want to." "I'll do it," he said. He came back from the root cellar 15 minutes later carrying a wooden crate. He set it on the table and stood back from it slightly, the way you stood back from something you weren't sure you wanted to be too close to. Mabel looked at it, and then looked at him, and he nodded once, and she opened it. 9 mason jars. The contents of every one of them had gone bad. 7 years was far too long for water bath preserved goods, and what was inside the jars was dark and sealed and definitely not food anymore. But the jars themselves were intact. Every lid had held. 9 good quart jars, which was 9 quart jars she didn't have before, which meant 9 more quarts of storage capacity for the fermentation program she was running. She lifted them out one at a time and set them on the table. He was watching her. 9 jars, she said. 9 jars, he repeated. "I'll clean them out and get them going," she said. "It'll take a few weeks for anything in them to be ready, but it moves the February calculation." He was quiet for a moment. "What will you put in them?" "Whatever's got the best nutritional argument for being preserved right now," she said. "Probably turnip and dried herbs if you've got any, and I want to try a second batch of the apple thing. The vinegar's coming along, and if I start another batch now, it'll be ready before the first one runs out." He looked at the 9 jars lined up on the table. "Okay," he said, and his voice had something in it she didn't examine too closely. She cleaned the jars that afternoon. She didn't hurry it. She washed each one in water she'd heated on the fire and dried them with clean cloth and set them on the shelf. And when they were all there, 9 clean jars catching the afternoon light from the west window, she felt a small, wordless satisfaction of the kind that came from a problem that had been met and moved past. She didn't look at what the original contents had been. Some things deserved to stay private. What she understood, living on that mountain through December and into the deepening cold of January, was that survival at this altitude was not a single act or a series of dramatic moments. It was the accumulation of small correct decisions made consistently, day after day, in the cold and the dark, and the repetition of work that never quite finished. The fire that was built right this morning bought you safety tonight. The water barrel, checked and cleared of ice yesterday, meant water without a 2-hour thaw operation today. The bread made 4 days ago was tomorrow's food when tomorrow was a day that made going outside to the root cellar a serious undertaking. She was good at accumulation. She had always been good at it. It was the same principle as the starter. Small, consistent inputs over a long time building to something that simple effort alone could never produce. But the mountain also had a way of interrupting accumulation with events that required a different kind of response entirely. It had a way of making you understand that all the preparation in the world was a negotiation, not a guarantee. The first of those interruptions came in the second week of January. She had been up since 4, which was usual, and the fire was good, and the cabin was warm by mountain standards, and she had the morning bread in the Dutch oven on the hearth when she heard the sound from outside that didn't fit. Not wind. She knew wind by now in all its variations, the long, low moan of it running over the ridge, the sharp percussion of it against the shutters, the particular hollow whistle it made when it found the gap between the woodpile and the cabin wall that they kept meaning to seal. This was different. This was below the wind, underneath it, a series of sounds she worked at identifying for 30 seconds before she realized what she was hearing. Someone was at the door. Not knocking, more like leaning against it, a weight pressing without intention. She was across the room in 4 steps and had the bar up and the door open before she stopped to think about whether that was wise, which it probably wasn't, but the sound had been wrong enough that she moved on instinct before caution caught up. The woman on the other side of the door was roughly Mabel's age, which meant probably younger because cold-aged people fast up here, and she was standing in the wrong way, not the upright stance of someone who had come to visit, but the bent-forward, arms-tight posture of someone who had been in the cold too long and was losing the argument with it. "Mrs. Alderman," Mabel said. She didn't know that for certain. She hadn't yet met the Alderman family Silas had mentioned, the ones 6 miles northeast. But the direction this woman had come from and the single family Silas had identified in that direction made the math simple. "My husband," the woman started. "Come in first," Mabel said. She got the woman inside and onto the chair nearest the fire before she asked another question, and she got the coat off her and wrapped the wool blanket around her shoulders and pushed a hot cup into her hands, and she waited while the woman's breathing steadied and the gray color in her face began to shift back toward something that meant blood was moving again. Her name was Ruth Alderman. She was 32 years old, and she had walked 6 miles in conditions that Mabel would not have chosen to walk 6 miles in because her husband had cut his leg with a draw knife 3 days ago, and the wound had gone bad. "How bad?" Mabel asked. Ruth Alderman looked at her with the specific eyes of a woman who had been sitting next to something frightening for 3 days straight, which was to say they were absolutely steady, in the way eyes went steady when there was no longer any room for anything but the necessary. "Bad enough that he can't walk on it," she said. "Bad enough that it's hot all the way up to his knee." Mabel looked at the window, full light now. She had maybe 7 hours before dark. "Where are your children?" she asked. "At home. My oldest is 9. She knows to keep the fire." "And she can do that?" "She was born up here," Ruth said with a flatness that was not unkind. Mabel went to the shelf. She had been assembling a medical kit since the 2nd week. Not out of prescience, but out of the same logic that governed everything else she did up here, which was that you prepared for the thing before the thing arrived, because after it arrived was too late to prepare. Calendula, yarrow, salt, honey, clean linen in a roll. The bottle of strong spirits that Silas kept in the back of the root cellar that he'd accepted without surprise when she brought it inside, because he was not a stupid man and he understood what she meant by it. She also had something she hadn't told Silas about yet, not because she was hiding it, but because it hadn't come up. Before leaving Copper Hollow, she had stopped at the back door of Dr. Hale's office, which was a thing she had done occasionally over the years, because she had learned that the doctor's back door was where the interesting information was traded rather than the front, and she had asked him what she ought to know about wound infection that she didn't already know, and he had spent 20 minutes telling her and also given her a small packet of a carbolic preparation that he trusted more than most things he had available and told her to use it sparingly and only if things were serious. She looked at the packet now. Then she looked at Ruth Alderman. Serious, she thought, was the word for it. She put the kit in her bag and she went to the cabin door and called Silas, who was at the woodpile splitting the morning's fuel. He came to the door with the axe still in his hand, and she explained the situation in 4 sentences, and he looked at Ruth Alderman and then at the sky. "I'll come with you," he said. "You don't need to," Mabel said. "I know the direction." 6 miles in this, he said, which was not an argument about her capability, and she understood that. He meant he was coming. "Fine," she said. "Let's go." They made the 6 miles in just under 2 hours on snowshoes, Ruth Alderman between them once she had warmed up enough to move properly. The terrain northeast of their cabin was different in character. More exposed, fewer trees as windbreak, the trail winding along the edge of a granite shelf that dropped off sharply on the downhill side and would have been genuinely dangerous in poor visibility, which today they had. Mabel stayed close to Ruth Alderman's right, and Silas took point, reading the route in the way he read everything, quietly and with absolute attention. She thought about asking him how often he'd been this way. She decided it didn't matter. The Alderman cabin was smaller than theirs and sat in a clearing that had less protection from the north than Mabel would have chosen. She filed that away without saying anything. It was their home and their choice, and she was here because someone was hurt, not because she had opinions about site selection. There were 2 children in the cabin when they arrived. The older one, the 9-year-old Ruth had mentioned, was indeed keeping the fire, with the practiced competence of a child who had grown up understanding that the fire was not optional. The younger one, who looked about 5, was sitting on a bunk wrapped in a quilt and watching the door with the solemn attention children gave to things they didn't fully understand and knew better than to ask about. Thomas Alderman was on the other bunk. He was 35 years old and large, the way men who did physical work in cold climates were large. Not just tall, but dense, as if his body had packed itself tight against the cold over the years. He was also, currently, the color of old paper, and the leg he had propped on a rolled blanket was the reason. Mabel looked at the wound without letting her face change. The draw knife had caught the inside of his right calf. A long cut, 4 inches at least, not deep enough to have hit anything truly critical, but deep enough to have been serious 3 days ago when it happened, and to have become considerably more serious since. The inflammation had moved up the leg the way Ruth had described, and the wound site itself was hot to the touch, and draining in a way that required immediate attention. "When did this happen?" she asked Thomas. 3 days back," he said. His voice was steady enough, but she could hear the effort in it. "What did you put on it?" "Clean cloth," he said. "Ruth boiled it first." "Good," Mabel said, and she meant it. That was the right call, and had probably bought him the time they needed. "What have you been eating and drinking?" He looked at her with slightly unfocused eyes. "Not much." "Ruth," Mabel said, "I need hot water, as much of it as you can heat, and I need it clean. New water from outside, not what's been sitting." Ruth moved. She had the particular efficient motion of a woman who was relieved to have something specific to do. Silas had positioned himself near the door, not in the way, not making himself prominent, just present in the way he was always present, solid and quiet and available if something needed his particular kind of help. Mabel worked. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, which Thomas bore with the tightened jaw of a man who wasn't going to make a sound in front of his children, and she used the carbolic preparation sparingly on the deep tissue the way Dr. Hale had told her to, and she packed the wound with the honey and yarrow preparation she had learned from her mother's mother and had seen work on infections that medical preparations hadn't solved. She bound it with the clean linen, tight enough to support without cutting off circulation. She checked his pulse. She checked the color of his hands and feet. She checked the lymph nodes along the inside of his thigh, which told her what she needed to know about how far the infection had traveled. It was bad. It was not irretrievable. "He needs to stay down," she told Ruth, in the kitchen side of the room, low enough that Thomas might not hear if he drifted. He was drifting, which was probably a mercy. "The leg stays elevated. He needs to drink constantly. Not cold water, warm. If he won't eat, get broth into him any way you can. I'm going to leave you what I have here, but I want to come back in 2 days and see how he's moving." Ruth Alderman looked at her with those steady, dangerous eyes. "Is he going to lose the leg?" Mabel looked at her directly. She did not flinch from the question, and she did not reach for something comfortable to say that wasn't true. Not if he stays down and you keep that wound clean and he drinks what you give him, she said. If any of those three things fail, I don't know. Ruth nodded. 2 days, she said. 2 days, Mabel said. They made the return trip in the early afternoon, the sun already dropping toward the western ridgeline in the way it dropped this far north in January, too fast, without negotiation. Silas and Mabel walked in silence for most of it. The terrain demanded attention, and they were both tired, and there wasn't much to say that hadn't been said in action. About a mile from the cabin, Silas said, "You knew what to do." "I knew enough," she said. "Where did you learn it?" "Bits of everywhere," she said. "You feed 20 men in a boarding house for 11 years. Some of them get hurt or sick and can't afford the doctor, and you're what's available. You figure it out or you don't." He was quiet for a few steps. "The carbolic thing." She glanced at him. "You saw that." "Hard to miss," he said. "I got it from Dr. Hale before we left," she said. "I was going to mention it." "You don't have to account for every decision you make," he said. "I know that," she said. "I'm telling you because you should know it's there." "Fair enough," he said. They walked. "Is he going to be all right?" Silas asked. "Probably," she said, "if Ruth can hold the line on the care." "She can," he said. "She's tough." "She walked 6 miles in January to get help for her husband," Mabel said. "I know she's tough." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of something else. Then he said, "Mabel." She looked at him. That was... He stopped. He looked at the trail ahead of them. "You did a good thing today." It was the most words he had put around that sentiment at once. She understood the weight of it. Understood that from him it was not a small statement, not filler, not the kind of thing people said because it was expected. "It's not done yet," she said. 2 more days before I know if it worked." "You did a good thing today," he repeated, and she understood he was not talking about the outcome. She looked straight ahead at the trail. "Let's get home before dark," she said. They made it with an hour to spare. 2 days later she went back, alone this time because Silas had spotted a deer trail he needed to check before the next weather system moved through, and she told him she could manage the route herself now, and she could. Thomas Alderman's color was better. The infection had not spread further. The wound was draining less. He was eating broth. Ruth walked her to the door when she left. "I don't have anything to give you," Ruth said. "Not right now. Come spring." "Don't," Mabel said. "Please." Ruth looked at her. "We don't take charity easily up here." "It's not charity," Mabel said. "It's what neighbors do. I'm going to be here a long time, I think, and I'd rather be the kind of neighbor who's worth knowing than the kind who keeps a ledger." Ruth Alderman was quiet for a moment. She had a way of being quiet that was different from Silas's. His silence was the stillness of a landscape, something you moved through. Hers was more deliberate, like a person sorting through options. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," Ruth said. "Silas came up from town last October with a wife, and nobody knew him to be the marrying kind. People had ideas." "What kind of ideas?" Ruth looked at her steadily. "That you might not last the winter." Mabel looked back at her with equal steadiness. "That's one way to put a bet," she said. "I never bet it," Ruth said. "Good," Mabel said. "You would have lost." And she put her snowshoes on and started home. February arrived with a cold that was different in kind from anything Mabel had experienced below the tree line. Not just lower in temperature, but different in quality. A dry, absolute cold that had no interest in negotiation, that crystallized moisture in your nose when you breathed through it, and made metal burn when you touched it barehanded, and gave the world outside the windows the brittle clarity of something that had had all the softness removed from it. Silas had been right about the winter. It was the worst he'd seen in 12 years, which meant it was the worst Mabel had ever been inside of, and she found herself grateful every single day for every decision they had made in November and December. The extra wood, the fermentation crocks, the root cellar reorganization, the water channel maintenance. Every small act of preparation had compounded into a margin that was, some days, exactly the margin that stood between comfortable and genuinely difficult. She was aware that she was also learning things about herself that she hadn't known before. Not revelations exactly. Nothing so dramatic. More like confirmations. She had always believed she was not the kind of person who panicked. February on a Montana mountain at 9,000 feet was the kind of experience that tested that belief thoroughly. and she found, with something that was partly satisfaction and partly something more complicated, that she had been right. She didn't panic. She got cold and tired and sometimes frustrated, and once, in the second week of February, she had a bad hour in the root cellar where she stood in the cold counting jars and thinking about March, and felt the specific sensation of the walls being closer than they should be. But she breathed through it, and she finished the count, and she came back inside, and she put the kettle on, and she didn't mention it. She didn't mention it to Silas. She told herself this was because there was nothing practical to say, and that was true. And it was also true that there was another reason, which was that she was not yet entirely sure how much of herself she was allowed to bring to this arrangement. The practical parts of her, the capability, the knowledge, the judgment, she had deployed without hesitation. But the other parts, the parts that sometimes stood in root cellars feeling the walls move, those parts she had kept to herself for so long that she no longer knew how to put them down. She was thinking about that one evening in mid-February when Silas came in from checking the trapline looking wrong. Not hurt. She went through the checks quickly, the way she'd learned to, the visual inventory of a person coming in from outside in this kind of weather, looking for the signs of trouble. He was moving well. His hands were moving, which meant they were warm enough. His face was... She stopped on his face. He sat down at the table without taking his coat off. That was wrong. He always took his coat off as the first thing, because the transition from outside to inside required you to shed the outside layer quickly, and he knew that. She didn't say anything yet. She poured coffee. She set the cup in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it. "Gus Fenwick's gone," he said. She sat down. "Gone how?" "Gone like the kind of gone you don't come back from," he said. "Found him on the eastern ridge. He'd got turned around in that blizzard 4 days back. Exposure." She looked at the table. She thought about the man Silas had described to her, reliable in an emergency and unreliable about everything else. She had never met Gus Fenwick. She felt the weight of that absence now in a way that surprised her. Felt it not as the loss of a person she knew, but as the sudden terrible visibility of the isolation up here, the way it surrounded them on all sides, and mostly you didn't look at it directly, because if you did, you understood that the margins were even thinner than the root cellar calculations suggested. "Was he alone?" she asked. "Always alone," Silas said. "No family. Nobody waiting." "Someone waited," she said. "You went looking." He was quiet. "You went looking 4 days after the blizzard," she said. "In this." She gestured at the window. "I go by his line every few weeks," Silas said. "That's just... You do that up here." "You do," she said. "Yes." He drank his coffee. She got up and put the pot over the fire to start supper because supper needed starting, and because doing something with her hands helped her think, and because she understood that Silas was not a man who needed her to say more than she had already said. Some things you just held together, and that was the whole of the comfort you could offer. After a while he said, "He had a dog." She turned. "Fenwick had a dog," Silas said. "Old gray thing. She was there with him." Mabel looked at him. "The dog?" "She's all right," he said. "Cold and hungry, but she'd been keeping herself going off something. I don't know what." He paused. "I brought her back." Mabel looked at the door. "I left her in the barn with Cobb," he said. I should have asked." Mabel looked at him for a moment. In 2.5 months of living with this man, she had learned many things about him, and one of the clearest was that he did not make space for things he didn't mean to keep. The list with names. The 9 jars his wife had put up, kept untouched for 7 years. His own sparse and specific way of making room for something. "She get along with Cobb?" Mabel asked. "Well enough," he said. "Then she can stay," Mabel said, and went back to the pot. The dog's name had been something Gus Fenwick called her that Silas couldn't remember precisely, so she became, by the silent consensus of 2 people who didn't discuss it, simply the dog for the first week. She was a medium-sized gray animal of indeterminate breed, with 1 brown eye and one that had gone blue-white with age, and a personality that announced itself clearly on the second morning when she came inside from the barn for the first time and went directly to the spot nearest the hearth and lay down with the complete conviction of an animal who had decided where she belonged and was not interested in debate. Mabel looked at her. The dog looked back. "Fine," Mabel said. The dog closed her eyes. She called her Frost by the end of the week, because of the color and because it fit, and Silas used the name without comment from the moment she said it, which was how names got agreed on between them. Frost turned out to be useful in the way that good dogs were useful, not trained to any specific task, but alert and attentive, and possessed of a sense for weather changes that proved more reliable than the barometer Silas kept on the wall by the door. She would move from the fire to the window sometimes as much as 2 hours before a storm arrived, and Mabel learned to read that movement the same way she learned to read everything else up here, as information, as something to act on. But the deeper thing about Frost, the thing Mabel didn't say aloud but understood, was that her presence changed the character of the cabin in some way that was hard to articulate. Not because a dog was warmer company than two people could be on their own, more because there was something in the uncomplicated nature of the animal's trust that loosened something. Frost leaned against Mabel's legs when she was standing at the work surface. She put her head in Silas's lap in the evenings without being invited, and he rested his hand on her gray head in the way he rested his hand on things he was comfortable with, without thinking about it, which meant he meant it. They were not quite the same people, after Frost, as they had been before. Mabel couldn't have told you specifically how they were different, only that the cabin held something more than two practical people in their work now, and that the more was not unwelcome. In the last week of February, Mabel woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she had never heard before. She was awake and upright before she was fully conscious, which was a thing that happened when you lived somewhere that demanded alertness, and she sat in the dark with her heart beating hard and listened for the sound again. It wasn't Frost. The dog was awake too, sitting up at the foot of the bed with her ears forward, but she wasn't alarmed in the way she would have been for something outside. She was looking at Silas. Mabel looked at Silas. He was making a sound that took her another second to categorize because she had never heard him make it before. And even then she wasn't entirely sure because he was doing it in sleep, or what looked like sleep. His face contracted in a way she had never seen his face do while he was awake. It was a sound of effort, of something resisted, of something that was happening that the person it was happening to was not choosing and could not stop. She put her hand on his shoulder. He came awake fast, the way he always came awake, instantly, completely, without the gradual surfacing that most people did. He sat up. He looked at her. She kept her hand where it was. He looked at the wall across from the bed. He breathed. She waited. After a while, he said, "I was dreaming." "I know," she said. He said nothing else for long enough that she thought that might be all. Then, "It's February," he said. She didn't understand that immediately. Then she did. "She died in February," she said. "Third week," he said. 7 years ago. She sat with her hand still on his shoulder. She could feel the tension in it, the residual tightness of whatever the dream had been, slowly releasing. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her then. In the dark, by the low red light of the banked fire, his face was different than it was in the day. Not softer exactly, but less guarded. Whatever he used during the day to keep the surface still, he didn't have it fully in place right now. "It happens every year," he said. "The third week." "Has anyone been here with you when it does?" she asked. "No," he said. She took her hand off his shoulder. She lay back down. He sat for a moment longer. Then he lay back down too. Frost resettled at the foot of the bed. The fire breathed in the hearth. "I heard you," she said. "I'm glad I heard you." He was quiet for so long she thought he might have gone back to sleep. Then, "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She looked at the ceiling of the cabin, the underside of the roof she had now lived under for 4 months, the logs she had come to know the grain of, the smoke-darkened surface of a structure that had been standing before she arrived and would be standing after her and was, right now, holding both of them against a February that had not finished with them yet. She thought about what Ruth Alderman had said, that you might not last the winter. She thought about the 9 jars on the shelf, the wood stacked good through March, the fermentation crocks lined along the warm wall, Frost breathing steadily at the foot of the bed. Outside, the mountain was exactly what it had always been, enormous and indifferent, and asking the same question it asked of everything that tried to live on it. The question was not complicated. It was the oldest question. Are you built for this? Mabel Rourke. Mabel Crowder now, though she still sometimes forgot and then remembered and found she didn't mind. lay in the dark of the cabin she had made into a home, and listened to the mountain ask its question, and understood, in the particular quiet of a February night at 9,000 feet, that she had been answering it for a long time before she got here. The answer, every morning, was the same. She got up and built the fire. The third week of February passed the way Silas had said it always passed, with a particular weight to it that was separate from the cold, separate from the work, something that lived in the cabin alongside them without being invited and without apologizing for itself. Mabel didn't try to talk him through it. She didn't offer comfort in the form of words, because she had learned enough about this man in 4 months to understand that words applied to grief. The way he carried it tended to push it deeper rather than ease it. What she did instead was what she always did. She kept the fire, she kept the food coming, she kept the work moving forward, and she let him be where he was without requiring him to be somewhere else. On the 4th night of that week, he came in from checking the line earlier than usual. She looked at him when he came through the door, and she could see the difference, not resolved, not over, but moved through to the other side of something. He hung his coat. He sat down. He ate what she put in front of him. Then he said, "She would have liked you." Mabel looked up from her plate. "My wife," he said. "Eleanor." It was the first time he had said her name out loud in Mabel's presence. "She was practical the same way you are. She wasn't a woman who needed things explained twice." Mabel sat with that for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," she said. "She was," he said. He looked at his plate. "I used to think I was doing something wrong, keeping her memory the way I did. Like it meant I wasn't moving forward, or whatever the right phrase is." "I don't know what the right phrase is," Mabel said. "Neither do I," he said. "But I think carrying it isn't the same as being stuck in it. I think I confused those two things for a long time." She looked at him. "What changed?" He looked at her directly. "You were there," he said, "the other night. And it didn't make the dream worse. It made it smaller, like it could fit in the room without taking up all of it." Mabel set her fork down. She looked at the table. She thought about what to say and decided that what she actually wanted to say was probably the truest thing available, so she said it. "I'm glad I was there," she said. He nodded once and went back to eating, and that was the end of it, in the way that important things between them always ended. Without ceremony, without being draped in more language than they needed, filed away and kept. March arrived with what felt like a shift in the mountain's intentions. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but a change in the quality of the cold, a degree or two of relent that showed up first in the way the snow surface behaved in the afternoon sun, softening at the top while staying solid beneath, and in the way the light came through the west window at a slightly different angle than it had in February, longer and less horizontal. Mabel noticed it the way she noticed everything on this mountain now, with her whole body, because her body had learned to read the environment the way it read a kitchen, through sensation and accumulated pattern rather than deliberate thought. The margins they had worried over in December and January had held. The fermentation crocks had done what she'd designed them to do. The lacto-fermented vegetables provided through January and February the nutrition that dried stores alone couldn't, and she could see the difference in both of them, the way they moved through February without the slow cognitive heaviness that she had warned Silas about, and that she had seen take men apart in long winters below the tree line. The bread held them. The smoked meat held them. The dried bean sprouts she had been growing on the warmest shelf in the cabin, a trick she'd learned from an old woman in Copper Hollow who had learned it from someone before her, had provided enough green nutrition in the darkest weeks that neither of them had developed the bleeding gums and joint ache that she had seen in men who made it through hard winters on dried meat and nothing else. They had made it through, not without cost. Not without the cost of Gus Fenwick's absence marking the eastern ridge, not without the cost of the third week of February, not without the cost of the particular accumulated tiredness that came from months of cold and dark and constant vigilance. But they had made it through with everything that mattered intact. Then, on the 14th of March, Silas didn't come home. He had left that morning before first light, which was normal. He had said he was checking the lower trap line, the one that ran along the creek drainage 2 miles south and east of the cabin, which was a route he covered roughly every 4 days, and which typically took him 3 to 4 hours depending on what he found. By noon, he hadn't returned, which was not yet alarming. By 2 in the afternoon, it was notable. By 4, with the light already going flat and the temperature beginning its evening drop, Mabel was standing at the window with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set, and Frost sitting at her feet looking at the door. She told herself a list of practical reasons. He had found a deer and was dressing it out in the field. He had taken a longer route back for some reason she didn't know. He had stopped to check something on the way. The trapline had been more complex than expected. She told herself these things with the same rigor she brought to everything, and found that rigor sufficient to keep her functional, but insufficient to move the cold weight that had settled somewhere below her sternum at around 3 o'clock and had not moved since. At 4:30, she made the decision she had been working toward for the past 90 minutes. She put on every layer she had. She got her snowshoes. She got the lantern and the flint and the emergency kit she had assembled in January and kept packed and ready, because she had always known there would be a day she needed to move fast and not spend 10 minutes looking for things. She looked at Frost. "You know where he went," she said. Frost went to the door. That was enough. She let Frost out and she followed, closing the cabin door behind her, and she let the dog set the direction, which was southeast and slightly downhill toward the creek drainage. Frost moved with the efficient ground-covering trot of a dog who knew what she was doing and had a destination, not the random exploration pattern of a dog following her nose toward something interesting. She knew. Mabel trusted that. The trail to the creek drainage was one Mabel had been on twice before, once in November when Silas had showed her the trapline route, and once in January when she had needed to check whether the creek was accessible for water during a period when the upper spring channel had frozen at the collection point. She knew the terrain in the way she now knew most of the terrain within 2 miles of the cabin. Not perfectly, not with the map-level knowledge that Silas carried in his head from 12 years, but well enough to move through it in fading light without making the kind of mistake that mattered. Frost stopped twice on the way, both times at the edge of areas where the snow was disturbed in ways that told a story Mabel read as she went. The first disturbance was where Silas had knelt to check a trap set along a windfall. She could see the knee impressions and the boot prints and the drag marks of something pulled from the set. So he had been here and had found something and had been working. The second disturbance was larger and less orderly, and it was here that Frost stopped and did not continue forward, but turned back and looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at what was in front of her. The creek drainage came into view below a short slope, the creek itself running black and fast through a gap in the snow ice, swollen with the early melt from the southern exposures above it. The gap in the ice was larger than it would have been a month ago. The banks on either side were the particular soft, undercut shape of creek banks in early melt. They looked solid and were not, the snow extending beyond the actual bank edge in an unsupported shelf over the moving water below. She saw his pack first. It was on the near bank, set down deliberately. Not dropped, set down, which meant he had been thinking when he put it there. Then she saw the marks in the snow that led to the edge of the bank, and the edge of the bank which was now ragged, broken inward. She was moving before she finished reading the scene. She went down the slope to the creek bank without running, because running on this terrain in these conditions was how you ended up in the same situation she was looking at, and she went carefully and fast in the way that careful and fast could coexist when there was no alternative, and she came to the bank edge and looked. Silas was in the water. Not submerged, he had his arms over the remaining intact section of bank ice, and his upper body was out of the water to his chest, and he was holding, but he was holding in the specific contracted way of someone who had been holding for a while, and whose arms were beginning to lose the argument with the cold and the weight of saturated clothing pulling him down. He looked up at her. His face was the wrong color, past the flush of cold work, past the hectic red of exposure, into the gray-white that was the serious stage, the stage where the body had made decisions about what to keep warm and what to sacrifice. His eyes were clear. That mattered. "Don't come to the edge," he said. His voice was controlled, and it cost him something to make it that way. "Bank's rotten. You come to the edge, you'll go in with me." "I know," she said. She was already looking at the pack he had set down. She opened it without hurry. He had rope on the trapline. He always had rope. She had watched him pack it every morning. She found it in 30 seconds. "How long?" she asked. "An hour," he said. "Maybe more." An hour in this water. She did not let herself think about what an hour in this water had done to his core temperature. There was no useful action attached to that thought. "I'm going to throw you a line," she said. "I need you to get it around your chest, not your hands. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. She tied one end of the rope to the base of the largest tree within reach of the bank, a white bark pine with a trunk she couldn't have gotten her arms around, rooted deep enough that it wasn't going anywhere. She made the knot with hands that were cold, but not cold enough to be clumsy, because she was not in the water and she had been out for 40 minutes and she could still feel her fingers, which meant they worked. She threw him the other end. He let one arm off the ice to catch it. In the second that arm came free, his whole body dropped 3 inches into the water, and he made a sound she had never heard him make. A short, involuntary sound of effort, and something that was not quite pain but was the body's cousin to it. He got the rope, and she watched him work it under his arm and across his chest with movements that were slower than they should have been, that had the particular labored quality of someone operating a body that was no longer fully cooperating. "Good," she said. "Is it across?" "Yes," he said. "I'm going to pull," she said. "When you feel it come taut, you need to kick. Whatever you have left, you use it to kick." "I know how it works," he said, and under the gray and the cold there was something in his voice that was almost, not quite, but almost, dry. "Good," she said. "Then do it." She pulled. The rope went taut against the tree and she threw her whole body weight into it, leaning back with both hands on the rope, her feet braced against the tree roots where they broke the surface of the snow, every muscle she had committed to the single direction of away from the creek. She felt the resistance, his weight and the water's weight, and the angle working against her, and she pulled through it the way she had held the wagon on the icy road in October, not by being stronger than the problem, but by refusing to move backward. She heard him in the water behind her, the sound of effort, and then a different sound, the creak and give of the bank ice as his weight came onto it, and she kept pulling, kept leaning back, and then she heard him clear of the water and she held the tension on the rope until she heard him say, "Stop." She turned. He was on the bank, not standing, on his hands and knees on the intact section of bank, clear of the broken edge, head down, breathing, alive and not in the water. The rest of the accounting could wait. "We need to move," she said. "Right now. Can you stand?" He got to his feet. It took him 2 attempts, and she didn't help him until the second attempt, because she understood instinctively that a man like Silas needed to try first, and because the second attempt succeeded. He was standing. He was the color of old ash, and his clothing was saturated, and the temperature was dropping by the minute as the sun went behind the ridge, but he was standing and his eyes were tracking and his legs were under him. "My pack," he said. "I have it," she said. She had put his pack on over her own without thinking about it. "Walk." They walked. She put him in front of her on the trail because she needed to watch him and because Frost walked ahead of them both, setting the pace and the direction, and Mabel watched Silas's gait with the focused attention she had used to watch Thomas Alderman's color, looking for the signs that told her how fast they needed to go and whether he was holding. He was holding. Barely, and getting less barely by the minute, but holding. She talked to him for the entire 40 minutes it took to get back to the cabin. Not comfort, not reassurance, nothing sentimental, just words that required him to keep processing, to keep his brain engaged. She asked him questions. She asked him about the deer he'd dressed out, whether it was a doe or a buck, where exactly he'd set the trap line, what he'd found in the last check before he went to the creek. He answered, slowly and with increasing effort, but he answered, and she counted each answer as a small victory against the cold that was working through him like a tide coming in. She got him through the cabin door. She got the fire up in the time it took most people to find the flint. She had built this fire so many times she could do it with her hands working faster than her thoughts. And the cabin was not cold because she had banked the fire well before she left. Within 10 minutes, the hearth was giving serious heat. She got him out of the wet clothes. This was not a moment that had any dimension other than the practical one, and she brought to it exactly that. The brisk, efficient focus of someone removing a hazard, working fast because fast was what the situation required. Silas was past the point of self-consciousness about it, and she was past the point of having any feelings about it, except the functional ones. The wet things came off. The dry things went on. The wool blanket went around him, and she got him close to the fire, and she kept him there. He was shaking hard. That was correct. Shivering was the body doing what it was supposed to do, generating heat through movement, which meant his body still had the resources to do it. She had read enough about cold exposure in the doctor's books she'd borrowed over the years to know that the dangerous stage was when the shivering stopped, because that meant the body had given up on the strategy, and she watched him for that the way she had watched Thomas Alderman's color, with the part of her mind that never fully stopped monitoring. He didn't stop shivering for a long time. She was grateful for every shiver. She heated broth, the real kind, bone broth she had simmered for 8 hours 2 weeks ago, and put up in a sealed jar against exactly the kind of emergency where something hot and dense with substance was the difference between adequate and critical. She got it into him slowly, not all at once, watching him for the signs that his body was accepting it rather than rejecting it. He drank it. He kept it down. She sat beside him on the floor in front of the fire with Frost pressed against his other side, and she maintained the monitoring the way she had maintained the fire all winter, constantly, without making a performance of it, because the job required it, and performing it would have done neither of them any good. At some point he stopped shaking. Not the dangerous kind of stopping, the right kind, the kind where the body has won the argument with the cold and the shivering is no longer necessary because there is enough heat to sustain without it. His color was coming back. Not all the way, not yet, but coming. She checked his hands and feet the way the doctor's book said to check them. Capillary refill, sensation, and everything was moving in the right direction. He looked at her from inside the blanket. "You went out in that," he said. "Yes," she said. "I told you the bank was—" "You told me not to go to the edge," she said. "I didn't go to the edge." He looked at her for a long time. "I had the rope tied off before I threw it," she said. "I wasn't stupid about it." "I know," he said. "That's not—" He stopped. He looked at the fire. "I've been out here 12 years, he said. "I know that creek. I've crossed it 100 times. I know where the bank goes soft, and I went to the wrong place today, and I—" He stopped again. "It was early melt," she said. "The edge moved from where it was last week." "I know why it happened," he said, and there was something sharp in it, the particular edge of a man's voice when he is angry at himself and trying not to be angry at the nearest available person instead. "I'm not making excuses." She looked at him. "I know you're not. I'm saying I've been alone out here for 12 years and I've been careful, and I was careful today and I still went in, and if you hadn't—" He cut himself off. The fire cracked. Frost adjusted against his side. "You'd set your pack down," Mabel said, "before you went to the bank." He looked at her. "You set it down deliberately," she said, "before you went to check the edge, in case something went wrong." He was quiet. "That's not a man who isn't thinking," she said. "That's a man who is thinking far enough ahead to put his pack somewhere it wouldn't go in with him. If you hadn't done that, I might not have found the rope in time." He was still quiet. "I'm not telling you it wasn't serious," she said. "I'm telling you I found you because of something you did right." He looked at the fire for a long time. Then he said, "You're a strange woman to argue with." "I'm not arguing," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it strange." She felt something move through her that she recognized after a moment as the specific physical sensation of fear releasing. Not fear she had been fully aware of while it was happening, because she had been too busy, but fear that had been running underneath everything since she looked over that creek bank and saw him in the water, now letting go of her chest and her shoulders and the back of her throat all at once, leaving her slightly lightheaded and very tired. She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands for approximately 10 seconds. Then she straightened up and looked at the fire. "I was scared," she said. Not to him exactly, more to the air in front of her, to the fact of it. "I know," he said. "I don't scare easily," she said. "No," he agreed, "you don't." "I want you to know that," she said, "because I need you to understand that what I did out there I did because I was scared, not because I was, I don't know, being capable for the sake of it. It wasn't performance." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open, something that had set down whatever it usually carried. "Mabel," he said. She looked at him. "I know that," he said. "I know exactly what it was." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was between them and around them, and Frost was warm against his side, and the cabin was holding the way it always held, And Mabel understood in the particular clarity of exhaustion and relief combined that something had shifted between them on that creek bank that was not going to shift back. She didn't name it. She had never been a woman who needed to name everything. She got up and put more wood on the fire. She kept him in the cabin for 2 full days. He didn't argue much, which told her more about how he had actually felt than anything he said, because Silas Crowder did not submit to rest easily or willingly. She monitored his hands and feet for the first 24 hours with the regularity of someone who understood that frostbite's damage sometimes revealed itself slowly, but everything came back fully. No tissue damage, which was a piece of luck she didn't take for granted. He slept through most of the first day and she let him sleep, and she ran the cabin the way she ran it when he was on the trap line, fully and without interruption. And she also did something she had not done since the first weeks of arriving on the mountain, which was to sit at the table in the middle of the afternoon with a cup of coffee and nothing required of her for the next 10 minutes. And she sat with that unusual stillness and thought. She thought about the creek bank. She thought about the rope tied to the tree. She thought about the look on his face when she had turned and seen him clear of the water, on his hands and knees on the solid bank, the gray going slowly out of his face. She thought about what he had said, something open, something that had set down whatever it usually carried. She had left Copper Hollow 5 months ago with a Dutch oven and a spinning wheel and an 11-year-old sourdough starter and a marriage that was 6 hours old when they started up the mountain, and she had made from those materials, and from the cold and the work and the 9 jars and the rope and frost and the list with her name at the bottom and 100 mornings of getting up and building the fire, a life that bore no resemblance to the life she had been living before. It was harder. It was more dangerous. It asked more of her every single day than the boarding house kitchen ever had, which was saying something because the boarding house kitchen had asked a great deal. But it was hers, not hers alone. That was part of what made it different from everything before. It was hers and Silas's in a way that had become impossible to separate, not because they had dissolved into each other, but because the work was genuinely shared in the way he had promised it would be, divided by ability and not by expectation, built by 2 people who were better at the whole of it together than either of them was at half of it alone. She had not expected to feel that. She had hoped for it in the abstract way you hoped for things you didn't fully believe in yet, and now it was not abstract anymore. On the second morning of his recovery, Silas came to the table for breakfast under his own authority and sat down and ate everything she put in front of him, which was her signal that he was substantially all right. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She sat down. "Before I went to the creek," he said, "I found something on the lower trap line, near the boundary of my registered range." She waited. "Someone had pulled 3 of my traps," he said. "Not animals. The sets were too clean. Someone had found them and pulled them deliberately, and the sets weren't in any condition that would have made them visible unless you knew what you were looking for." Mabel set her cup down. "Devereaux," she said. He looked at her. "You're quick," he said. "You told me about him in the first week," she said. "You said you stayed away from him because of how he operated in emergencies. Someone who prices his neighbors into desperation isn't going to stop at his own property line if he thinks he can extend his range without consequences." "He's been running his line further south every season," Silas said. "Last year I found sign of it, but nothing I could prove. Those traps were mine. They had my markers on them. And they were pulled and reset 30 yards north of where I'd placed them, which puts them just inside my registered range, but just barely." "He's moving the line," she said, "incrementally. Enough that each individual instance looks like an argument about exact placement rather than deliberate encroachment." "Yes," he said. "How long has this been going on?" 3 seasons that I can document," he said. "Longer, that I suspect." She looked at the table. She thought, "Has he done this to anyone else on this mountain?" "The aldermans lost 3 beavers from their creek stretch last winter," he said. "They blamed it on a competitor they couldn't identify." "But you think it was Devereaux?" "I think it was Devereaux," he said. She looked at him. "What have you done about it?" "Nothing yet," he said. "I don't have enough that would hold up with the territorial office. A man like Devereaux knows exactly how much he can do without crossing the line that has consequences." "Then we need enough," she said. He looked at her carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that a man who does this kind of thing reliably leaves a pattern," she said. "And patterns can be documented. I'm thinking that the aldermans probably have more evidence than they realize they have, and I'm thinking that Gus Fenwick's eastern range is now unoccupied, and Devereaux has certainly noticed that. Silas was very still. If he moves on Fenwick's range, she said, he'll be doing it before anyone can file for it, before anyone establishes a claim. There's no one to file, Silas said. No, she said. There isn't. She looked at him. Is there? The silence in the room was very specific. Fenwick had no family, Silas said slowly. No, she said. He didn't. His range would revert to the territory for reassignment, he said. It would, she said, unless someone filed a claim in the meantime. Silas looked at her for a long time. You're talking about us filing on Fenwick's range. I'm talking about whether that's something worth considering, she said. I'm not making the decision for both of us, but I'm saying that if Devereaux moves on that land before anyone does, he goes from being a problem to being a significantly larger problem. And if we file, we also have a legitimate reason to have eyes on that eastern ridge, which gives us a better position to document what he's doing to the existing line. Fenwick's range needs working, he said. You can't file a homestead claim and not work the land. I know what a homestead claim requires, she said. He looked at her steadily. That's a significant expansion of what we're already doing. It is, she said. We'd be stretched thin the first season. We would, she said. Yes. The access is difficult. The terrain on the eastern side of the granite shelf is harder than what we have here. Silas, she said. He stopped. I'm not telling you it's easy, she said. I'm telling you it might be necessary. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the window. He looked at the table. He picked up his coffee cup and held it. It would have to be filed before the spring melt opens the roads, he said. Otherwise word gets out and Devereaux files first. How long do we have? 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 7. She nodded. Then we have 6 weeks to decide. I think we've decided, he said. He said it the way he said most things, without drama, the same tone he would have used to say they needed more salt. But he was looking at her when he said it, and what was in his face when he looked at her was not the assessing measurement of the first weeks, not the careful reserve of someone not yet sure what they were dealing with. It was something else, something she was going to have to find a name for eventually. March continued its slow concession to something that wasn't quite spring. The light changed daily in ways she noticed in a way she hadn't noticed light change before coming to live on this mountain, more sensitive to it now, calibrated to the angle of it through the west window, reading in it the information about what the afternoon was going to do and what the next day might bring. The snow surface changed character. The creak they could hear from the cabin when the wind was right changed pitch. Frost spent more time at the window instead of the door. Things were moving. The mountain was not done with winter yet. There would be more storms, more cold, more of the absolute demanding dark that had been the texture of the last 4 months. But it was moving. You could feel it in the way you feel a tide turning when you're standing in the water. Not because the water is different, but because the pressure of it against you has shifted direction. One morning in the last week of March, Mabel woke before Silas for the first time since the early weeks of their marriage. She didn't know what had woken her. No sound, no specific shift in the cabin. She lay still for a moment in the dark, and then she got up carefully and went to the window. The sky outside was doing something she had never seen it do before. The stars were visible, which meant it was clear, and the moon was down, which meant the dark was complete. But along the eastern ridge there was a line of something that was not quite light yet and not quite dark, a quality of the sky that suggested the boundary between what had been and what was coming was somewhere very close. She stood at the window for a long time. Behind her, Silas's breathing was even and untroubled. Frost was a warm weight against the foot of the bed. The fire she had banked carefully before sleeping was still breathing in the hearth, not quite out, waiting to be built up again. She thought about the filing. She thought about Devereaux's careful incremental theft of what other people had built. She thought about Thomas Alderman on his bunk with his leg elevated, and Ruth walking 6 miles in January, and the 9 jars on the shelf and the rope tied to the base of the white bark pine. And she thought about a man she had married in a nightshirt judge's apartment at 4 in the morning after 6 hours of knowing him, who had eaten her bread and called it food built for winter and had meant something larger than bread by it. She was not a sentimental woman. She had never had the luxury of being sentimental. But she was standing at a window on a Montana mountain at the end of the hardest winter of her life, looking at the line between dark and what came after dark. And she understood with the particular clarity that came from exhaustion and survival combined that she was not the same person who had stood behind a Dutch oven in a harvest hall 5 months ago and decided not to cry. She was not better than that person. She was not fixed or transformed in the ways that stories sometimes suggested people got fixed or transformed. She still had the parts that were prickly and the parts that kept too much to themselves and the parts that found it easier to feed a room full of people than to ask one person for anything. Those parts were all still there. They were just living somewhere different now, operating in a context that asked different things of them. And what they produced in this context was different from what they had produced before. She heard the bed shift behind her, then his feet on the floor. Then he was beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he looked at what she was looking at, the line of almost light along the eastern ridge. "Spring," he said. "Not yet," she said. "Almost." "Almost," he agreed. They stood at the window together and watched the line of almost light grow by degrees, very slowly, the way everything real grew. Not all at once, not dramatically, but by the steady accumulation of small increments adding up to something that changed the entire character of the sky. When the first actual light came over the eastern ridge, Mabel turned from the window and went to build the fire. The filing had to be done in person at the Territorial Land Office in Copper Hollow, which meant going down the mountain for the first time since they had come up it in October. Mabel had not thought about going back. Not in a deliberate way. She hadn't made a decision to avoid it, hadn't constructed an argument against returning. She had simply been too absorbed in the work of being here to spend energy thinking about there. But now, standing in the cabin in the last days of March, helping Silas prepare the documentation they would need, the map of Fenwick's range boundaries, the statement of intent, the filing fee they had counted out in coin from the tin on the high shelf, she felt the fact of the return settling into her like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings she hadn't expected. She was not afraid of Copper Hollow. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had spent too much of the winter surviving things that deserved the word, afraid to waste it on a town that had mocked her bread. But she was also not the same person who had walked out of that harvest hall in October, and she was aware that returning as a different person to a place that had known the previous version was a particular kind of test with its own specific texture, different from anything the mountain had asked of her. She didn't say any of that to Silas. She packed what they needed, and she was ready before he was, which was not unusual. The road down was different in late March than it had been in October. The ice was gone, but the mud was something else entirely, deep and clinging in the way that mountain mud was in the melt season, the kind that grabbed at wheels and hooves and boots, with a suction that felt almost deliberate. Cobb worked it steadily and without complaint, which Mabel had come to understand was simply his character, a horse of enormous patience and no particular interest in drama, which suited the 3 people he had been transporting up and down this road for the past 12 years. Frost stayed at the cabin. She had looked at them with considerable suspicion when they left without her, and Mabel had felt an unexpected pang of something she didn't examine too carefully, because it was the kind of feeling that told you more about how attached you'd become to something than you'd necessarily intended. They came off the last of the switchbacks onto the valley floor in the early afternoon, and Copper Hollow appeared ahead of them with the particular smallness that places acquired when you had been somewhere genuinely large and then returned. The main street shorter than she remembered, the buildings lower, the whole of it fitting inside a single field of vision in a way that the mountain never did. Silas glanced at her. "All right," he said. "Fine," she said. Then, "It looks smaller." "It always does," he said. "Coming down." She looked at him. "You've made this trip before." "Every fall and spring for 12 years," he said. "It always looks smaller when you come back from up there. Then you're in it for an hour, and it goes back to normal size." She filed that away. "How long do we need to be here?" "Land office, general store for supplies, and whatever else you need," he said. "We can be back on the road by tomorrow morning." "I don't need anything else," she said. He looked at her again. She could feel the look without turning to meet it. "Mabel," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to make a scene. I'm not going to be—" She stopped. "I'm not going to be small about it," she said finally. "I know that," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at him. I was going to say that if anyone gives you trouble in this town, I am considerably less restrained than you are about what I say to people, he said, in the same flat, even tone he used for everything, which somehow made it more effective than if he'd said it dramatically. She looked at him for a moment. Don't do that, she said. Don't do what? Don't fight my fights, she said. I spent 5 months on that mountain learning that I can handle my own situations. I don't need you to manage Copper Hollow for me. He was quiet for a beat. Fair enough, he said. But thank you, she said. You're welcome, he said. The land office was a narrow room at the back of the Territorial Administration building, staffed by a man named Caldwell, who had been there since before Mabel could remember, and who greeted Silas with the recognition of a man he'd dealt with for years, and greeted Mabel with a briefly surprised look that he covered quickly when Silas introduced her as his wife. The filing for Fenwick's range took 40 minutes. Caldwell was thorough and unrushed, and Silas had brought everything in order, and Mabel watched the process with the attention she brought to things she needed to understand fully. The forms, the legal description, the survey markers that defined the eastern boundary, Silas had mapped from memory and from Fenwick's original filing, which Caldwell pulled from the drawer without being asked. When it was done, when the fee was paid and the receipt was in Silas's coat pocket, and they were standing outside the administration building in the March afternoon, Silas said, Devereaux has 6 weeks to contest it. Will he? He'll know it's been filed within a day, Silas said. Whether he contests it depends on whether he thinks he has grounds. Does he have grounds? No, Silas said, but that's never stopped him from making noise. She looked up the street. The general store was 3 blocks north. The Harvest Hall, where the next auction was 8 months away, was a block past that. She looked at all of it with the eyes of a person who had come a long way and come back. Let's get the supplies, she said. At the general store, run by a man named Whitfield who had taken it over from his father 10 years ago, and who was fair if not exactly warm, Mabel moved through the ordering with the efficiency of someone who had spent the last 5 months calculating exactly what they needed and could recite the list from memory. Flour, salt, specific dried goods, a particular iron hinge she needed for the root cellar door that had been failing since January, lamp oil, thread. She knew the quantities, she knew the costs, and she negotiated the price of the flour down by 6 cents per sack on the basis of buying 12 sacks at once, which Whitfield accepted with the expression of a man who recognized he was dealing with someone who knew what things cost. She was paying at the counter when she heard the voice behind her. I heard you came back. She knew the voice before she turned. Clara Hutchins. Clara Marsh. Now, if the gossip that Ruth Alderman had passed along during one of Mabel's visits to the Alderman cabin was accurate, married to the bank manager's son, who had outbid everyone else for her lemon cake at the harvest auction last October. Mabel turned. Clara was standing 3 feet away with her hands folded in front of her coat, and she looked exactly as Mabel remembered her. The arranged prettiness, the deliberate poise, except for something around the eyes that was different. Something that had not been there in October, and that Mabel recognized after a moment as the particular look of a person who has made a calculation about an approaching conversation and is not sure they've calculated correctly. Clara, Mabel said. You look well, Clara said. And then, in the specific tone of a woman who has rehearsed what she intended to say and is now discovering that the rehearsed version doesn't sit right in the actual moment. I heard you made it through the winter. We did, Mabel said. I also heard, Clara paused. I heard about the Aldermans, what you did. Mabel waited. I heard Tom Alderman would have lost the leg, Clara said. Or worse. He kept the leg, Mabel said. His wife did the follow-through care. She deserves most of the credit. Clara looked at her for a moment with an expression that was working through something complicated. That's very... You don't have to be generous about it. I'm not being generous, Mabel said. I'm being accurate. Clara was quiet. Then, in a voice that was quieter than Mabel had ever heard from her, the performance stripped out of it. I owe you an apology. Mabel looked at her. At the harvest supper, Clara said. What I said. What I did. She looked at a point somewhere near Mabel's shoulder rather than at her face, which told Mabel this was genuinely difficult rather than performed. I've been thinking about it since you left. Since I heard what you did this winter. She stopped. looked at the floor briefly, looked back. It wasn't right. The bread thing. None of it was right. I don't know why I did it. I think I did it because it was easy and because people laughed and she stopped again. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation and it's not a good one. Mabel studied her. In her old life, she had constructed a specific version of Clara Hutchins that was useful. A clean, uncomplicated version of someone who had made her life harder, because complicated people were harder to be angry at, and anger had been a useful fuel for a long time. Standing in the general store in March looking at Clara's uncomfortable face, she could feel that simple version becoming unavoidably complicated. Clara Hutchins was not a monster. She was a woman who had been unkind in front of an audience because it was easy, and because she had been young, and because the social architecture of Copper Hollow had made that kind of cruelty cost nothing. That didn't make it acceptable. It also didn't make it the totality of who Clara was. Mabel was 41 years old in her bones standing in this store. 30 years old in calendar fact, and 41 in the way that hard living ages your understanding of things. "I accept the apology," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, directly, the way she handled everything. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter because it did. I'm not going to tell you I've forgotten it because I haven't, but I accept it." Clara exhaled. Yes, thank you." "Don't do it again," Mabel said. "To anyone." Clara looked at her. "No," she said. "I won't." Mabel turned back to the counter and finished paying for the supplies. When she looked back over her shoulder, Clara had moved toward the fabric section of the store and was looking at cloth with the focused attention of someone who needs somewhere to put their eyes. Silas was outside loading the wagon. She went out and told him about the exchange while she helped him stack the flour sacks. He said. "That's all you have?" she said. "I have more," he said. But I've learned that when you tell me about a conversation you had, you've generally handled it correctly, and anything I add is mostly noise." She looked at him over the flour sack. "That's a very specific thing to have learned," she said. "It's been 5 months," he said. I'm a quick study when the material is interesting." She looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went back to stacking flour. They stayed the night at the only hotel Copper Hollow had, a 2-story structure with thin walls and a dining room that served the kind of food that made Mabel understand for the first time how profoundly her standards had been recalibrated by a winter of cooking in earnest. The food was not bad. It was simply made without the particular investment of someone whose cooking was the difference between people surviving and not surviving, and that difference was visible in every component of the meal. Silas ate it without complaint. Mabel ate it without complaint. They were both tired enough from the trip down that complaint would have been more effort than it was worth. In the morning, before they left, 3 things happened that she had not anticipated. The first was that Whitfield stopped them as they were settling the wagon account and said, quietly, that he'd heard about the Aldermans, and that if they were looking at expanding their operation up on the mountain, he might be interested in talking about a standing arrangement for flour and other dry goods, supplied at a regular rate and delivered to the bottom of the mountain road twice a year. She looked at him. "What kind of arrangement?" "The kind that benefits both sides," he said. "You'd be buying regular and large. I'd be selling regular and certain. That's worth something to both of us." She thought about it for approximately 8 seconds, which was about 6 seconds longer than she needed. "We'd want the price we negotiated yesterday on the flour, locked for a full year," she said. "And I want the hinge order filled exactly. Not close exactly. The size matters." "Done," he said. She put out her hand and he shook it. The second thing was a man she didn't know. Heavy set, roughly 50, with the outdoor coloring of someone who worked in the high country, who stopped Silas outside the land office and spoke to him in a low voice for several minutes while Mabel waited with the wagon. When Silas came back, he had an expression she had learned to read as someone working through implications. "Who was that?" she asked. "Man named Frey," he said. "Homesteader. Northern Range, up past the granite shelf." He paused. "He says Devereaux came to see him last week. Came to him with a proposal about the Eastern Territory. Fenwick's Range." "He knew it was open," she said. "He knew before we filed," Silas said. "He'd been watching it. He told Frey that he was going to expand into it, and that Frey might want to discuss he called it an arrangement for access through the northern boundary." Mabel was quiet for a moment. He was going to move on Fenwick's land and then sell access rights through it to Frey. That's what it sounds like, Silas said. And Frey came to tell you because Frey has a sense of how things should work up here, Silas said. And because Devereaux's been pricing him on emergency supplies the same way he's been pricing everyone else. And Frey's had enough of it. She looked at Silas steadily. We need to talk to Frey properly, she said. Not here, but at some point this spring. He said the same thing, Silas said. He said if we're working Fenwick's range, we'd be his closest neighbors to the east, and he wants to know who he's dealing with. He's about to find out, she said, and Silas looked at her with that expression she still didn't have the right word for. And they got in the wagon and started home. The third thing happened at the edge of town as they were passing the harvest hall. A woman was sweeping the steps, a woman Mabel recognized as Vera Pickworth, Clara's friend, the one who had lifted the lid of the Dutch oven and called it heavy at the auction in October. Vera saw them and stopped sweeping and looked at the wagon as it passed, and for a moment her and Mabel's eyes met. Vera Pickworth did not look away first, but she also nodded. One small, specific nod, the kind that acknowledged something without naming it. Mabel nodded back. The wagon moved on, up the valley road and back toward the mountain, and Mabel sat with that wordless exchange for a while and thought about what it was. Not forgiveness, not friendship, not anything that deserved a large name. Just acknowledgement. Just one woman to another saying, I know what happened and I am not proud of my part in it, without either of them having to open their mouths. It was smaller than what she might have wanted in October. She found, in March, that it was exactly enough. Spring came to the mountain in its own order and at its own pace, which bore no resemblance to the schedule Mabel had associated with spring in the valley. Down in Copper Hollow, spring arrived in April, with mud and birdsong, and the particular relief of people who had spent winter indoors finally being able to open windows. Up here, spring arrived in stages over weeks, each stage requiring a different response. Nothing simply resolving into warmth and green without first passing through 3 more storms and at least 1 week of temperatures that made January seem like it had been warming up. But it came. The meadow below the cabin, the one she had seen from the ridge on her first day, brown and winter flattened, began showing green from the south edge first, where the granite outcroppings above it held warmth and reflected it back onto the soil below. The water in the creek drainage changed sound and speed. Cobb began requiring less of his winter feed ration because the south-facing slopes were producing enough early grass to supplement. Frost started spending time outside in the afternoon, sitting in patches of sun, with her eyes closed in a way that looked so deeply satisfied that Mabel caught herself smiling at it. There was more work in spring than in winter, which Mabel had not fully anticipated. Winter was work, but it was the work of maintenance and endurance, keeping what you had, holding what you'd built against what was trying to break it. Spring was the work of expansion, of building the next layer, and it arrived all at once after months of deprivation, with a kind of energy that was demanding in its own way. The garden she had planned through February, sketching it in the margins of the inventory sheets when the calculations were done, went into the ground in early May. She had her seed box from Copper Hollow, the varieties she had been selecting for 5 years, the carrots with the shorter season that she had developed specifically because the summer in the boarding house town was long enough to finish them, but probably not at this altitude, the kale variety that could survive light frosts at either end of the season. She planted them, and she did not know yet if they would work here. That was the honest truth of it. They might not. The altitude and the soil and the specific microclimate of this particular hollow below the granite outcrop might produce results that her experience below could not have predicted. She planted them anyway. You couldn't know a thing until you tried it, and she had never been a woman who let not knowing stop her from starting. Silas broke additional ground for her without being asked, extending the kitchen garden patch by 1/3 to give her room for the bean trials she wanted to run. She noticed this one morning when she came out to check the moisture on the newly turned soil and found it already worked and raked, the previous day's trapline route apparently having included a detour back to the garden with a spade. She didn't say anything about it. She planted beans in the new section and noted in the back of her mind that she would need to add a 3rd fermentation crock for the fall preservation run. The Devereaux situation resolved itself in the particular ugly way that situations involving men like Devereaux tended to resolve. Not cleanly, not quickly, but through the slow accumulation of documented fact eventually becoming too heavy to ignore. He filed a counterclaim on Fenwick's range in April, as Silas had predicted he would, citing an error in the original survey boundary and claiming that a portion of the eastern range had historically been worked in conjunction with his own registered holdings. The claim was thin, and Silas had known it would be thin, which was why he had spent the 3 weeks between their return from Copper Hollow and Devereaux's counterfiling documenting every piece of evidence he had: the moved trap markers, the survey coordinates he had recorded personally over 3 seasons, and the statement from Frey about Devereaux's premature proposal regarding access to land he had not yet legally claimed. Ruth Alderman contributed a written account of the missing beavers from the previous winter, which she delivered to Silas on a Tuesday in April when she came over the granite shelf trail to return the medical supplies Mabel had left with her in January, and which she had written herself in a hand that was clear and exact and showed someone who had thought carefully about every word. "You didn't have to come all this way," Mabel said, when she opened the door and found Ruth there. "I had things to return," Ruth said. "The jars weren't urgent." "No," Ruth said, "but I wanted to see how you came through." She looked at Mabel with those steady eyes. "And to give Silas the account about the beavers." "Come in," Mabel said. Ruth sat at the table and drank coffee and looked around the cabin in the way of someone inspecting rather than admiring. Not rudely, just thoroughly, the way mountain people looked at things they wanted to understand. "You changed the kitchen," she said. "I reorganized it," Mabel said. "Silas didn't mind?" "He minded the first week," Mabel said. "Then he couldn't find the salt twice in the same day, and we had a brief conversation about whether the old arrangement or the new one was more logical, and then he didn't mind anymore." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Something moved through her expression that was close to amusement. "How was the winter?" she asked, and Mabel understood she was not asking about the weather. "Hard," Mabel said. "Good." She thought about it. "Both at the same time, mostly." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's the one honest thing you can say about a winter up here," she said. "Hard and good at the same time." They talked for 2 hours. Not about anything that would have seemed important to someone who didn't live on this mountain. The practical texture of the season, what had worked and what hadn't, the specifics of garden placement and water management, and which of the 2 routes between their properties was less dangerous in mud season. But Mabel found herself in the conversation in a way she had not found herself in conversation in a very long time, saying things that were actually what she thought without running them through the filter she had maintained in Copper Hollow, the one that had been calibrated to produce the version of herself that would cause the least friction in a room that didn't want her. Ruth Alderman wanted her in the conversation. Not for what she could provide, not for what she had done for Thomas's leg, not for any reason that had a transactional structure, just because she was someone worth talking to. It was such a simple thing. Mabel had not understood entirely how long she had gone without it. Devereaux's counterclaim was rejected in June by the Territorial Land Office in a decision that Caldwell communicated to Silas by post. The letter was 6 sentences long and straightforwardly worded, and Silas read it twice and then set it on the table and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The claim was rejected. The evidence was sufficient. Fenwick's range was theirs. That evening, Mabel made bread. Not because the occasion demanded it. She made bread 3 times a week without needing an occasion, but because she wanted to, which was a reason she had not fully permitted herself before. The distinction between making bread because there was bread to be made and making bread because the particular rhythm of it in her hands was something she chose. She made the bread, and she put it in the Dutch oven, and she set it over the fire, the way she had set a Dutch oven over fires her whole adult life. And while it baked, she sat at the table and she thought about what had happened in the past 8 months with the particular attention she gave to inventory. Not sentimentally, not with the distorting lens of wishing anything had been different, but squarely, adding up what was there. She had left a town that didn't want her with a man she barely knew, and she had carried her starter up a mountain in freezing rain and held a wagon on an icy grade and reorganized a root cellar and treated a wound infection and spent a winter learning a new vocabulary of cold and endurance and held a rope to a tree on a creek bank and filed a land claim and accepted an apology. She hadn't owed it to anyone to accept and made a friend on a granite shelf trail, and through all of it she had discovered that the things she had believed about herself in the abstract, that she was capable, that she didn't panic, that she could be useful in a crisis, were true in the specific and not just the general, which was the only kind of true that actually counted. She had also discovered things she hadn't been looking for. That she could live with another person without performing herself for their benefit. That she could be scared and functional at the same time. That a man who wrote her name on a list of people worth knowing was offering something she had been hungry for longer than she had known she was hungry. That bread was still bread regardless of who laughed at it, and what it was built from told its own story, regardless of whether anyone in the room knew how to read it. The smell from the Dutch oven changed. The particular shift from baking to baked, from raw grain character to something deep and developed that she had learned to read as accurately as a clock. She checked the crust with her hand and pulled the pot from the fire and set it on the trivet and left the lid on while it rested, because the resting mattered, and people who skipped it because they were impatient ended up with bread that was wet inside. Silas came in from the garden as she was lifting the lid. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the loaf, the way he had looked at the very first loaf she made on the mountain, with the specific attention of someone who is not being polite but is genuinely paying attention. "What's the occasion?" he said. "No occasion," she said. He came to the table and sat down. She cut him the first slice the way she always cut the first slice, the heel, because the heel had the best crust and the most developed flavor, and she had been giving the best piece away her whole life without knowing that she could just say so. He ate it. She watched him eat it with the same attention she always brought to watching people eat her bread. Not for the compliment, not for the reaction, but because the bread told her things about itself in the eating, and she was still learning this mountain bread, still having the conversation with the water and the altitude and the particular character the starter had developed up here. "It's different again," he said. "Better or worse?" He thought about it. "Neither," he said. It's settled into itself. Like it knows where it is now." She looked at the loaf. She cut herself a slice, which was not something she always did. She often ate the ends, the fragments, the pieces she'd cut around, and called it tasting and not eating, which was a habit from years of feeding others first. She ate the slice. He was right. It had settled. The sharpness she had noticed in the first months was still there, but it had lost the quality of newness. It was no longer the character of a culture in a strange environment adjusting to unfamiliar water. It was the character of a culture that had been here long enough to call this place its own. 11 years of history and one mountain winter, and the thing had made itself at home. She thought that was worth noticing. In the second week of August, she went back to Copper Hollow for the second time. Not for land office business, and not because she had to. Because Whitfield had the autumn flower order ready, and because Ruth Alderman had asked if she might come with her, her first trip down in 2 years, and because Mabel had decided on her own, and without discussing it with Silas, that she was not going to let Copper Hollow become a place she needed to brace herself against. The trip down was easier in August than it had been in March. The road dry and solid, the light clear and high, the mountain showing the short, vivid green of a summer that knew it had limited time and was making the most of it. Ruth rode beside her on the wagon bench while Silas followed behind on horseback, having business of his own at the feed store and the tack maker, and requiring, he had said, the freedom of his own timetable. "You nervous?" Ruth asked, about a mile out from town. "No," Mabel said, and checked herself honestly and found it was true. "Tired of the question, maybe?" Ruth laughed. A short, surprised sound. "Fair enough," she said. The harvest supper was still 6 weeks away, which Mabel knew because Whitfield had mentioned it when she'd sent the order letter, adding as a postscript that the town had been discussing some changes to the auction format, details unspecified. She had not asked what changes. She was curious, but not enough to hurry toward it. What she found in Copper Hollow in August was a town that related to her differently than it had 10 months ago. And she was honest with herself about what that meant and what it didn't mean. It didn't mean the town had changed fundamentally. It meant the town had received new information about her and updated its assessment accordingly, which was what towns did and what people did, and she was not going to pretend that was the same as them having been wrong to begin with or having genuinely recalibrated what they valued. Some of them had recalibrated. Some of them were simply relating to her the way people related to anyone who had proved useful, with the warmth that usefulness attracted, which was real but conditional, in ways that genuine warmth was not. She knew the difference. She had been reading that difference her whole life. But some of it was genuine, and she took the genuine parts for what they were without inflating them into something larger. Mrs. Hensley from the millinery, who had stood at the back of the harvest hall and not laughed, stopped her on the main street and asked specifically about the lacto-fermentation, having heard about it from a woman who had heard about it from Ruth. And the conversation was the kind that happened between two people who were both interested in the actual subject rather than in each other's opinion of them. And Mabel enjoyed it straightforwardly. She told Mrs. Hensley she would write down the method and have Whitfield pass it along with the fall order. "You'd share it?" Mrs. Hensley said. There was something slightly surprised in her voice. Mabel looked at her. "It's not a secret," she said. "It's been done for 1,000 years. I learned it from someone who learned it from someone. That's how these things work." She ran the errand with Whitfield. She had coffee with Ruth at the hotel while Ruth's children were visiting their grandmother, who lived above the dry goods store. She loaded the wagon with the flour and the specific items on her list, and she was ready to leave by mid-afternoon. She was at the wagon when Clara Hutchins came across the street. Clara, who had said, "I owe you an apology" in March, and meant it in the complicated way people meant things they'd thought about for a while. Clara was carrying something. Mabel recognized it after a moment. A basket, the kind used in the harvest auction, covered with cloth. "I have something for you," Clara said. She held out the basket. Mabel looked at it. "It's a lemon cake," Clara said. I know it's a strange thing to bring, but I've been thinking about what I said at the auction, about making it right in some way that means something." She paused. "I know you don't need my cake. I know you've been baking things this winter that I couldn't compete with on my best day. But I thought—" She stopped. Mabel looked at the basket. She looked at Clara. "I thought it was the right gesture," Clara said, more quietly. "Even if it's a little ridiculous." Mabel took the basket. "Thank you," she said. Not warmly and not coldly, like a person who has accepted something that was genuinely offered. Clara nodded. She looked like someone who had done something difficult and was not sure it had gone well enough to be worth it, and was going to have to live with the uncertainty of that. "How's the married life?" Clara said, because apparently she had used up her courage on the cake and needed something lighter. "Cold in winter," Mabel said. "Good the rest of the time." Clara almost smiled. "That's all of Montana," she said. "Yes," Mabel said. "I suppose it is." She drove back to the mountain with the flour and a lemon cake, and Ruth Alderman beside her on the bench and Silas behind on his horse. And when they crested the last rise before the valley gave way to the switchbacks, she looked up at the mountain, at the specific shape of the granite shelf, at the green-gray of the pines, at the thin smoke that was not there now, but would be there when the weather turned, rising from the chimney of a cabin she had made into a home. And she felt something she did not try to name, because naming it would have required reducing it to a single word, and it was more than a single word. The harvest supper came in September. She had not planned on going. The plan had been the flower order and the standing arrangement with Whitfield and the Aldermans coming to the mountain for the long visit Ruth had been talking about since April. The harvest supper had not been part of the calculation. Silas brought it up 2 weeks before. "I heard they changed the auction," he said. "Whitfield mentioned it." "Changed how?" she said. "Open bidding now," he said. "Not for courtship, just for the food. Anyone can bid, any pairing, or you can come just for the table. Ruth said there was a push for it last spring. Some of the women organized it." She looked at him. "Someone organized it." "Apparently," he said. He had the careful, neutral tone of someone who has prepared a position and is waiting to see if it needs defending. "Did Mrs. Hensley organize it?" Mabel asked. "Whitfield didn't say." She thought about it. "We'd need to stay over," she said. "Hotel's not expensive," he said. She thought about the Dutch oven on the shelf. She thought about the starter, which was its most vigorous in September, the long summer of twice-weekly feedings, having brought it to a peak of activity and flavor that she had been working towards since the first mountain loaf in October. She thought about what bread built to last actually meant, not just the physical endurance of it, not just the density and the crust and the complex flavor that came from 11 years of feeding and 3 bad winters and 1 mountain winter that had changed its character entirely. She thought about what it meant to carry something that long and then put it in a room full of people. "We'll go," she said. She baked the loaf the morning they left, timing it precisely so it would be at its best by evening, fully cooled, crust at its texture peak, the crumb set properly, but the flavor still forward. She wrapped it in cloth and put it in the Dutch oven, and put the Dutch oven in the wagon with the same care she took with everything that mattered. The harvest hall in September was the same harvest hall it had always been. The same low ceiling, the same lantern light, the same accumulated smell of wood and tallow and food, and the particular warmth of a room full of people who had been cold for enough months that warmth in a room still registered as something to be grateful for. But it was different in the particular way that things become different when you are different from the person who was last in them. The table was not the auction table anymore. It was just a long table covered with food, open, with people moving around it and taking what interested them and leaving contributions beside what they'd taken, a kind of communal accounting that had no formal structure but seemed to work anyway, the way informal structures in small communities sometimes worked better than the formal ones they replaced. Mabel set the Dutch oven on the table. She lifted the lid. Nobody laughed. People came toward it the way people came toward a fire in cold weather. Not because anyone told them to, but because something in the particular smell of properly made sourdough, the complex yeast and acid and deep grain character of it, did something to people at a level that was older than their opinions about what things should look like. A man she didn't know took a piece and ate it where he stood, and looked surprised by his own reaction. Mrs. Hensley came and cut a piece carefully and ate it with her eyes slightly closed, which was what people did with food they were actually tasting. Ruth Alderman was there with Thomas, who was walking without a limp, which was its own kind of testimony to what the winter had done and what it hadn't done. Clara Hutchins was there with her husband, who turned out to be perfectly ordinary, not unkind, just ordinary, a bank manager's son who had wanted a pretty wife and gotten one and seemed content with that, which Mabel found less interesting than almost anything else in the room, but also not her business. Clara looked at the Dutch oven and then at Mabel, and for a moment they were back in the general store in March. Two women with a history between them that was not clean and not fully resolved and probably never would be fully resolved, because these things rarely were. Clara nodded once. Mabel nodded once. That was the whole of it. Silas was beside her, not performing anything, not demonstrating anything, just there in the way he was always there, solid and quiet and present. "How is it?" he said, nodding toward the table. She looked at the Dutch oven, from which people were cutting slices with the communal knife, leaving pieces for each other, not racing for the best portion. "Good," she said. He looked at her. "One word," he said. She glanced at him. "One word is enough sometimes." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She cut a slice herself. Not the heel this time, not the fragment, not the tasting piece she had been giving herself for 40 years, while she gave everyone else the good part. She cut a real slice, and she ate it standing in the harvest hall in September, with the lantern light around her and the noise of a room full of people who had all made it through a winter together. And it was the bread she had always known it was. Complex and dark and dense with the character of everything that had made it. 11 years and 3 bad winters and 1 mountain winter and a spring that came slowly and a summer that was short and vivid and a woman who had never stopped feeding the thing even when she had nothing to spare. Some things were not built to be pretty. Some things were built to survive the long cold and the ice and the dark and the nights when you didn't know if what you were maintaining had a future worth maintaining, and to come out the other side of all of that still going, still alive in the specific way that alive meant, when it really counted. Not just existing, but functioning, producing, feeding whoever was there to be fed. She had known that about the bread her whole life. She was only now beginning to believe it fully about herself. The mountain was up there in the September dark, waiting the way it always waited. Without urgency, without sentimentality, with the absolute indifference of something that had been here before anyone and would be here after. It did not care whether she was brave or afraid, capable or struggling, noticed or invisible. It asked the same question it had always asked. She had been answering it since October. She intended to keep answering it for a long time. She finished her slice. She put the lid back on the Dutch oven. Not because the bread was done, it wasn't. There was most of a loaf still there for anyone who wanted it. But because the lid belonged on the pot, and the pot was hers, and she had carried it a long way, and she was not finished with it yet. Beside her, Silas was talking to Thomas Alderman about the trapline and the spring claim, and the particular difficulty of the eastern terrain now that they were responsible for it. Ruth caught Mabel's eye across the room and raised an eyebrow in the specific way that meant something like, "How are you doing with all of this?" And Mabel raised an eyebrow back in the specific way that meant something like, "Fine." actually, which was true in all the ways that mattered. She was not the woman nobody wanted. She was never going to be the woman Copper Hollow had imagined it wanted. The delicate, careful, decorative version that fit the shape of what small towns sometimes decided women were for. She was something else. She was the woman who had held the wagon on the ice and held the rope to the tree and held the fire through the longest night and held herself together through a winter that had taken a good man off the eastern ridge and threatened to take her husband off a creek bank and asked of her, daily, everything she had, and sometimes slightly more. She was the woman who had carried a sourdough starter through everything and kept it alive. That turned out to be exactly what it had always been. Not a small thing, not an ordinary thing, but the whole point. She was built for this. She had always been built for this. She just hadn't had the right mountain to prove it on.